Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Comics Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club Comics Masterpiece Edition. And got a really good book this month. One of the books that I would say is very much responsible for me to owning a comic shop at all, for my development as a reader and what my interests are and what ultimately this store became. So I don't think we'd have a Graphic Novel of the Month Club if it wasn't for this book, which is Saga of the Swamp Thing, Volume 1, written by Alan Moore and illustrated by Stephen Bissette, who is right here. Hello, Steve. How are you, my friend?
Hello, Brian. It's great to see you and hear you. So thanks for having me.
I'm very, very, very happy to do so. This is my version of Saga of the Swamp Thing, my first edition copy, which is what's on my bookshelf at home, and it is beat to crap. You really can't see how bad
it's well-loved. A well-loved,
It's a well-loved book, yeah. So, but it's a different version than this. It's got different contents, but in fact, I still have my copy of Swamp Thing 20 as an individual comic book on the shelf next to that because 20 isn't in this book. This starts with 21. So that's my little thing there. That's silly. So the first question is, and this is always the first question, and yours I think will be a very interesting answer, I have to imagine. Why comics? Of all the things you could be doing in the world, why is it that comics set you on fire?
Well, I mean, I was born in 1955. I'm a monster kid. You know, I grew up during the dinosaur boom of the late 50s, early 60s, the monster boom of the early 60s. And comics were all around me as a little kid. Even though I was growing up in northern Vermont, in Essex Junction, Vermont, until I was 4.5, and then we moved to a very tiny town called Duxbury, Duxbury. And even in rural Vermont, comic books were everywhere, you know? I have an older brother. He and his friends all had stacks and stacks of comics. My circle had comics. I mean, comics were omnipresent when I was a kid in the early 60s. So it was definitely the storytelling medium that I grew up with as much as television. Better than television in a way, because comics were something I could read in private. I could read them outdoors. I could read them in my room. Early 60s was still when most households, certainly our household, only had one television set in the front room. And you were watching what the family was going to watch. So comics were more private media. There were two reasons it really became the one I went after, though, Brian. One was my first best friend in the world lived across the street from me in Duxbury. His name was Mitch Casey. And Mitch Casey was the first person I ever saw draw a comic. I was probably 5 years old. Mitch and I were both famous Monsters of Filmland devotees. And there had been a giant ant movie like Them had played on TV, or Monster from Green Hell with the giant wasps. And Mitch folded a piece of paper and made the first mini comic I ever saw and drew the cover, and it was Attack of the Giant Tsetse Flies. And it had these giant flies going toward a dam with a little stick guy on top of the dam with a machine gun and the little dashes to indicate the machine gun fire. And it blew my mind. You know, I had been reading comics for as long as I could consciously remember at the tender age of 5. But I never thought about that people made them. And by seeing Mitch draw that, it made me realize, oh, people make these things. And it made me realize I can make these things. Because if Mitch can draw them, I can draw them. And that was a revelation. Mitch and I used to draw our own little mini monster magazines and our own little mini comics. And they were one of a kind. There were no photocopying, didn't exist yet. You know, it certainly wasn't available to us. So we would draw one of a kind. And once that comic was gone, given to a friend or to a family member, that was it. And then as I got older, you know, my early preteen years, I really wanted to make movies. But the only technology available to my generation was silent 8mm or silent Super 8 film. There was no way to make sound movies.
Yeah.
And I also realized quite early on that if I was going to make a movie, I would have to convince other kids that it was worth spending time working on my crazy idea. And that was hard to do. It was almost impossible to do. And gradually, with doing theater in junior high and high school and seeing how much work went into theater productions, I used to be in the high school musicals and so on. And also continuing trying to make films, I realized by the time I was in my early teens that comics was the way to go because I didn't have to convince anybody anything. If I had a piece of paper and time and the skill to draw, that was the storytelling medium that I could actually tell stories in without having to mobilize time, money, people. And what really tipped me over the edge was underground comics. Once I saw Zap #2, that blew the top of my head off. And I realized anything was possible in comics. Prior to that, like, most kids of my generation and age, mainstream newsstand four-color comics were all we saw. And that was still kind of a magical medium, It's just like we couldn't make a TV show or we couldn't make a movie that was like the movie you'd see in a theater or the TV show you'd see on TV. Four-color comics seemed as distant as that. Whereas once I saw underground comics, and that would have been around 1970 when I was 15, that's when I realized anything was possible. And that's when I really became obsessed with, okay, I am going to create comics. I don't know how I'm going to do it. I don't know how I'm going to get them out there, but I stuck with it.
Neat. So I'm assuming the pharmacy or the grocery store was carrying comics in Duxbury then?
Yeah, it was funny. At that time in the early 60s, comics were pretty much everywhere. I could jump on my bicycle and I could bicycle into the next town across the Winooski River, Waterbury, and there were two places that sold comics, Vincent's Pharmacy, and there was a little market whose name I'm not going to remember that was right by the Duxbury Bridge across into Waterbury, and they had a little comic rack. If we got ambitious, we could bicycle 10 miles down North Duxbury Road, which was a dirt road, into Jonesville, and there was another comic book stash there in a little grocery store. And when I would travel with my parents, Burlington, Vermont was as close as we had to a city in Vermont. And there was this amazing place on Church Street called Colette's. It was a magazine and probably a tobacco store, although I didn't pay attention to what was on the other side of the store. I just cared about the comic and the magazine rack. And comics were pretty much everywhere. Even when we would go to a supermarket or a department store, there was usually a comic rack or a spinner rack somewhere in the store. And it wasn't until, I think around the time, once we get to like 1967, 68 is when I look back and I realized, distribution was kind of contracting. It was getting harder to find comic books as we got closer to 1970. But even then, once I had a license at age 16 in 71, my habit, I would go to the movies 3-4 times a week. I kid you not. And the best were the drive-ins. And I had scoped out grocery stores I could stop at and get a couple of sodas, some snacks, and a couple comic books so that I could read them in the car, before it got dark enough for the drive-in movie to start. So comics were pretty easy to get a hold of back then. Also, because we were in New England, Brian, I'll also mention, we got all the Charlton comics as well. And that may be because, Charlton being in Derby, Connecticut, that I was in a part of New England where they actually had distribution. But they were all the DC, Marvel, Charlton, the Archies, Harvey Comics, Classics Illustrated. They were all available.
Yeah. So how did you find Zap at age 15?
This is a good story. I have to thank once again publicly my high school art teacher, my junior high art teacher, William Cathy. Hello, Bill. I hope you're out there listening. I can tell this story now because Bill is retired and no longer teaching. Bill Cathy was our art teacher at Harwood Union High School in Duxbury, Vermont. I was part of the first class that went through that school from 7th grade to graduation. And Bill was a new teacher at the time. And he saw I had a sketchbook. And art class at that time was pretty rudimentary. They'd set up like a milk can, an apple, a corn husk, and you'd have to draw that. And that bored me shitless. But Bill, at some point, I had allowed him to look at, or I'd even loaned him my sketchbook, which was full of my weird, crude comics and monster drawings. And Bill brought in a copy of Zap number, I think it was either number 2 or number 1, because Zap 0 we won't go into the whole thing, but there was a Zap Zero. The artwork got lost. Zap #1 came out first, and then Crumb redrew Zap Zero. So it must have been Zap #1 because Meatball was the first underground comic story I ever read. And Bill said, I'm going to give this to you to take home. You can't show it to anyone, and you can't tell anyone you got it from me because I will be fired.
Yeah.
And I snuck it home, and I read it, and it changed my life. I mean, that one comic book was just, it pulled the blinders off. It made me realize that anything I could imagine could be put down on paper in comics form. And I hadn't had that thought before, because when you grow up with, Comics Code approved books, and even Dell and Gilberton with, and Gold Key, even though they weren't with the code, they were all, all ages comics. Yeah. I had never seen anything that was speaking to me the way that Zap Comics spoke to me. And that was it. That was, from that point on, I gave up on wanting to make films. I was just into comics. And then after that, then the question was, okay, my art teacher gave me this. How do I get more of these?
Big check.
And I'm lucky that Burlington, Vermont is a college town. In fact, at that time, I believe there were 3 colleges in Burlington: Champlain College, Burlington College, and the big one, University of Vermont, better known as UVM. That meant there were hippies up in Burlington. And that meant there was a head shop up in Burlington that was called the Land of Oz. And they had a rack of Last Gasp comics. Okay. Also on Church Street was a college-aimed chain bookstore called The Little Professor. And they had standing rack of underground comics as well, which featured comics from Rip-Off Press, San Francisco Comics, some of the other publishers of the underground. Another hippie haven in driving distance of my home was Waitsfield, Vermont. And there was a place called the Vermont Bookshop. It was up on the 2nd floor of this huge municipal building that's still there. They had the best selection of underground comics of anybody. And so I had 3 venues I could buy underground comics at.
Nice.
Then I found out about Bud Plant, and I could mail order anything I could not find, at those shops. And I was a steady, frequent mail order customer of Bud Plants. I was working for my family's grocery store. We had a grocery store, BISSETTE's Market. I was racking up 40 hours a week. I had disposable income, so I could easily order from Bud every month. And pretty much did. I ordered everything. I mean, I got my hands on every underground comic that I knew existed.
Nice. Did you, just out of curiosity, since your parents owned a grocery store, did you guys have a rack of comics in the grocery store?
It's funny. We didn't. We did not carry magazines or comic books. We did carry the local newspaper, the Burlington Free Press. We carried the Sunday New York Times and the Sunday Boston Herald and the Sunday Boston Globe, but no comic books. And I think part of that is because by 1969, 1970, it wasn't particularly cost effective for a grocery store of our size to have a spinner rack. Either that or Dad just said no, knowing that I would probably end up reading, I'd be reading the comics instead of stocking the beer cooler and, so on and so forth. So no, we never carried comics. We did eventually start carrying some magazines. But dealing with the distributors, boy, I learned a lot, before I was even in college about the nature of magazine distribution, the whole thing of tearing the top of the magazine back, and that's what you return to the distributor and so on. So,
yeah. So you have had your brain lit on fire by Crumb, particularly.
Well, no, actually, it was Greg Irons, particularly.
Oh, was it Greg? Oh, okay.
Yeah, Crumb was the first I read, but by Zap #2 and 3. S. Clay Wilson quickly became an addictive favorite, and Victor Moscoso, which probably most people wouldn't associate with, I've never done anything like Moscoso's, but I think my favorite 2 cartoonists were Moscoso and definitely S. Clay Wilson. S. Clay Wilson would just appall and crack me up every time. But then I stumbled onto, I'm trying to remember what the first Greg Irons I read, probably Slow Death, an issue of Slow Death. And then I found out about Skull, and Greg Irons became the underground cartoonist for me. And there were others I really loved. I loved Charles Dallas's work. He had that kind of woodcut drawing style, and he had his own comic called Psychotic Adventures. But it was really Greg Irons, and particularly Tom Veitch and Greg Irons, the GITV team. Their comics were the best. They were just, to me, the best. And that's because of the bent of my nature that I loved horror comics already.
Yeah. So you started drawing your own stuff at that point?
Yeah. It was weird stuff too, Like I remember, I don't have that sketchbook anymore. I gifted it to a friend back in college. I wish I had a scan of that sketchbook. I had weird spacey 1 and 2 page comics that I would draw. I only drew with ballpoint pen, and eventually those little fine point pilot markers, that's all I drew with. So, and then Greg Irons, I was captivated by Greg's work, but I couldn't figure out what drawing tool he worked with. And I experimented with brushes, but the only brushes I could get my hands on were really shitty. and I gave up on that. Just could not emulate Greg's line. But I was drawing my own comics, and then it was really Skull Number 6, which came out in 1972. I was a junior in high school still. Skull Number 6 came out, and have you read that comic, Brian?
Sure.
Skull Number 6.
I mean,
okay.
It's been 20 years probably.
Okay,
so.
well, the Skull Number 6 is the only issue of Skull that's a single story. And part 1, it was a gothic tale. It was all written by Tom Veitch. And part 1 was illustrated by Greg Irons, and part 2 was illustrated by Richard Corbin. And I loved Corbin's work as well. And Greg Irons' chapter, the part 1, builds to this page turn that when I turned the page, so freaked me out that I dropped the comic on the floor. It was like I had to get it out of my hands because it was so terrible. What was happening in the story and the image that I was looking at was so awful that I dropped it on the ground, and my immediate thought was, I want to do this to people. How can I get this good, Yeah. And it was really Skull Number 6 that the fire had been lit, but Skull Number 6 was the one that was like, man, I have to do horror comics. Okay. I have to get this good if I possibly can.
Yeah. So how did you get to the Kubert School?
It was a very convoluted route,
right?
I mean,
in the first class, if
I was in the first ever class, and I was in the same class that Rick Veitch and Tom Yates, Ron Zalmi, Kara Sherman Torino. There was 17 or 18 of us in that first class, and only a handful of us, I think about 10 of us, stayed for the second year. It was a 2-year program. Right. But that wasn't until September of 76. I took a year off between high school and college because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew there was no way that I could learn comics in college. I remember going to the Rhode Island School of Design, to RISD, for an interview, and they looked at my portfolio and said, no, thanks. You're not for us. And I think I had gone to RISD because I had read somewhere that Walt Simonson had gone to RISD, so. But anyway, I didn't get in there. So I did 2 years at a small Northern Vermont college that at that time was known as Johnson State College. Now they've changed hands. I think it's part of the Northeast College circuit now. And while I was at Johnson State College, I had 2 really close friends, Jack Vanuker and Mark Whitcomb, who were both into comics. And I made another friend there, Steve Perry, who was the first comic collector I ever met. The first person who had long white boxes, the first person who had bags that he kept his comics in. And Steve Perry was a writer, not an artist. And I was in my second year at Johnson. I was a square peg in a round hole there. The head of the art department was letting me do an independent study on comics, but there was nobody to learn from there in terms of a mentor or a teacher. And Steve Perry had a subscription to the Comics Buyer's Guide. And he one day said, you're wasting your time here. You got to get out of here. This is where you need to go. And there was a column called Beautiful Balloons. Mm-hmm. Used to be in the Comic Buyer's Guide. And I don't recall whose column it was. You might.
A little before my time.
Okay, so, and that had the first announcement for the Joe Kubert School. There was a written article that Joe was going to open a school. It hadn't opened yet. And Steve brought it to my attention, and tore it out of that issue and gave it to me and said, you have to go to this school. And I remember agonizing over it, right? Do I stay for a third year at the college I'm at? The head of the art department is telling me he's going to put me on a hard course of anatomical studies. I'm going to be drawing from cadavers. I'm going to learn how to draw the human body inside and out. I had already done 2 sessions with cadavers, and I knew that wasn't for me, you know?
Right.
And it wasn't that I was squeamish. It was that I couldn't disassociate from looking at the body going, how did this person end up here in front of us, you know? And it wasn't comics. It had nothing to do with comics. It had nothing at all to do with comics. I wanted to tell stories, and the art department at the college I was at didn't understand that. So I applied to the Kubert School. I screwed up my courage and I applied to the Kubert School. And the critical fulcrum of that, other than my friend Steve Perry pushing me to do it, was that Jack Vanuker and Mark Whitcomb also pushed me to do it. They were like, yeah, you're wasting your time here. You need to be at this school. And I also had the considerable support of a friend named Tim Varick. And Tim actually bankrolled my first published comic. It was a comic called HIBBS. Okay. And we printed 200 copies at Johnson State College. It's in the underground price guides these days. Okay. And it was Tim Varick who paid for that print run. $200 got you 200 copies of a magazine-sized black and white 64-page comic back then. And that was my portfolio. That's what I sent to Joe Kubert. That's what got me in the door at the school. And Joe invited...
Were you selling HIBBS on campus? Is that a...
Oh, yeah. We sold it anywhere we could get it, you know. We brought it to some bookstores up in Burlington. In fact, the last time I ever saw a copy in the wild was in a bin in a used bookstore in Burlington, Vermont. It was $5. I bought it for my son. So.
Oh, nice.
And yeah, so we tried to sell the copies. We mailed them to every comic publisher, and the only one we heard back from was Warren Publishing, James Warren. Yeah. And they sent back the copy with a cover letter that said, "Your comic is aptly named." And that was it, right? My first rejection letter in the comic book industry. And Joe invited me up, and my dad insisted on coming with me. He wanted to see this operation. And I haven't gotten into it, but by this time I was 21. I had been fighting with my dad for 21 years because my wanting to work in comics made no sense to a blue-collar, diehard military father, right? None. I might as well have said, yeah, I'm going to breathe methane on Neptune, Dad. Right. So he insisted he was going to drive me up, and we went up to Dover, New Jersey, and we drove up to the grounds of the school, which is where the Baker Mansion still is. And the nanosecond that Joe shook my dad's hand, everything was okay. Because Joe was a man's man. And Joe had been in the military. And Joe had a family, a big family. And Joe had raised that family from his earnings as a cartoonist. And my life changed that second because I no longer had that battle with my dad. In fact, my dad helped subsidize my second year at the Kubert School. I had saved enough money to completely pay for 2 years of college at Johnson, and I still had enough in the bank to pay for my first year at the Kubert School and the room and board. And my dad believed enough in my path at the moment he met Joe that my dad, you know, helped me cover that second fateful year at the Kubert School. That's really, it was amazing.
Story. Loved the story.
It was incredible. And Joe and Muriel were just fantastic. I mean, Joe and Muriel Kubert, they launched that school. They were there every day of the week. And it was very much you very much felt like you had been welcomed into the bosom of the Kubert family. You know, we got to know their sons and daughters. They all knew us by name. You know, Muriel had gone above and beyond to help get Rick Veitch into the school. And I'll leave it for Rick Veitch to tell that story. And they were just extraordinary. And Joe was my mentor for sure, and became like a second father to me. And my dad was more than okay with that. I mean, my dad to his dying day had great love and affection and respect for Joe Kubert.
So what was a day at the school like?
Wow, that's a great question. You know, when we were there, it was an experiment. Joe had never done this, right?
Yeah.
Muriel had never done this.
Yeah.
And here they were running a small experimental educational institution in a glorious late 19th century, early 20th century mansion in this little haven, this little natural haven in Dover, New Jersey. And Dover was a New Jersey town very much on the skids. The 2 years we were there, from September of 76 until the spring of 78, and Rick Veitch, Tom Yates, John Toddleman, and myself stayed on another year, not to be at the school, but to live in Dover so that we could build our business relationships with, at that time, all of comics publishing was in New York City.
Sure.
Dover was on the skids during that time. When we got there in 76, there was a downtown movie theater, the Baker, that was still operational. It closed by the time I moved out of Dover. When we moved there, there were a number of grocery stores we could walk to. By our second year at the Kubert School, we were hiking almost 5 miles with backpacks to get groceries because none of us had cars, right? And Dover was really on an economic decline. And people forget, the mid-70s were horrible. There was the oil embargo, the gas line crisis, even in odd license plates where people could only get gas if their license plate ended with an even number or an odd number. I remember seeing fistfights in Dover at the gas station over people trying to get to the gas pumps. This is the economic environment that we were coming into the business in. And during our time at Kubert School was the DC implosion, when not just Joe, but 4 of our teachers come in to teach, devastated by having either lost work or their spouse had just been fired from DC, right? And we're like, oh, this is the business we're going to go into, But a day at the school, it was organized around a classroom structure. All of our drawing tables were on the main floor of the school. By the second year, we were then the seniors. It was a 2-year program. So we were up on the second floor, and the new class that came in, which included John Toddleman, were on the main floor where we had been the year before. And the classroom lectures would be held in the larger room with the drawing tables. And our instructors at that time were, let me see if I can remember everyone. Dick Giordano was teaching inking. Joe Kubert was teaching 2 classes. Ty Eisman was teaching lettering. Rick Estrada, Lee Elias. I mean, we had an amazing bevy of teachers there, including Kelly Harris, who at that time was married to Jack Harris. Jack Harris, the DC comic editor and writer. Kelly Harris was teaching us production and paste up and mechanicals. And it was incredible. And Joe's studio, Brian, was in the school. Joe's studio was in the door across the hall from where our tables were set up, across from the main classroom. And after hours, Joe often worked there. And if you behaved yourself, if you could be quiet, it was okay with Joe sometimes that we would go in and look over his shoulder while he was working. And watching Joe Kubert ink like 3 of those DC covers that he was doing at that time was incredible. And it was very much almost an apprenticeship program the further we got into that first year. If you were on top of your assignments well enough, Joe began bringing in work for us. And the work study program was you got paid. It wasn't a lot, but you got paid for any work you did. Your name did not go on the work. It was going to be credited to the Joe Kubert School. And we were doing commercial work by the end of our first year at that school.
It's insane.
Yeah, and the ones that really stepped up to the plate, like Rick Veitch. I mean, Rick became a real workhorse because Rick wanted to learn every aspect of the craft. I was fussier. I wanted to work on the stuff that interested me, right? Rick wanted to absorb everything. Rick was also older than me and wiser. And Joe, really developed a sweatshop studio there. We were doing the Heroes World catalogs, those crazy catalogs with all the tchotchkes of, Spider-Man and Superman and so on. We were doing PSA comic books like Sparky the Fire Dog, about fire prevention and safety in the home. Rick Veitch did a ton of penciling and some inking on the World Color comic about how comics were produced and printed. That was a trade publication for prospective clients for World Color when World Color was printing almost all the comic books in North America.
Yeah.
So we were doing a lot of work there.
So I'm assuming that as students, you felt fantastic that you were doing work that was getting printed and published and you were getting paid. But I also have to imagine that what you were getting paid was not.
It was dirt.
What Cooper was getting paid for.
It was dirt. It was dirt, you know. We knew going in that it was going to be very low rates. The rates that Joe paid us for the backup stories or the battle albums that we did in Sergeant Rock. And if any of your listeners and viewers are interested, I mean, a lot of our early work appeared in the back pages of Sergeant Rock starting in 1977. And you start looking through those issues of Sergeant Rock and you'll find Rick Veitch, myself, Tom Yates, Jan Duursema, Tom Mandrake, Tim Truman. A lot of us did our first published work in 4-color comics as backup material in Sergeant Rock. Gag pages, battle albums, which were single page or double page, like pinups with information about aspects of military history, and backup stories. And Joe also, I mean, sometimes we would be working from scripts that Joe assigned. So we were working from scripts by Bob Kanigher and Archie Goodwin, but he also would allow us to formulate our own scripts. If we pitched a story to Joe and he went for it, we would script and get to draw our stories. I got to do a story with Tom Yates that I wrote for Tom called Live by the Sword, Die by the Sword. And I think that was my first published mainstream comic script where I wrote it but didn't draw it. Yeah. And, so we were doing a lot. That was really important work. And it was important because once you saw your work printed, you understood the changes you had to make in how you worked at the drawing board to facilitate the best looking artwork for the printed media. You realize that what you saw with your eyes is not what the camera saw. This is before digital media, digital printing, and so on. And it was a steep learning curve to wrap your head around, what I'm doing with my pen is not going to look the way I'm thinking it's going to look once it's printed.
Can you give an example of that, of kind of a thing that might be?
Sure. I'll give you one example right off the top of my head. I had to abandon, ballpoint pen and Pilot marker right off the bat. I mean, that kind of fine line work wouldn't reproduce at all in a 4-color comic. Joe Kubert is the guy who put a Winsor Newton Series 7 brush in my hand. And within 24 hours, I was like intoxicated with working with that brush. Like that brush, it was like I had been handed the right magic wand. I was, Harry Potter, and they finally gave me that wand that I needed. And I just fell in love with working with brush. And I came to learn that I could get any kind of line with that brush. And I also came to learn what kind of brush lines reproduced better than others. And here's the example I can give you. When we were at the Kubert School, by 1977, here's a little esoteric comics history for your diehard followers in the club. Mainstream comic printing switched from metal plates to plastic plates right around 1976, 77. And what that meant is metal plates, if you did a fine line, metal plates would continue to reproduce that fine line with great clarity and precision. Plastic plates, because of the speed with which offset printing is running those pieces of newsprint through the press, the metal plates would begin to heat up, and the finer the line, the more it would begin to almost melt on the plate. And you start seeing wavy lines appearing in printed comics because the fine line work is beginning to break down during the printing process. Yeah. And part of why I developed my brush and ink style that I, am known for is because working with brush was more compatible with the plastic printing plates that we're using than working with a crow-quill nib.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense to me. Absolutely.
And in fact, if you look, Brian, at some of those comic books, the original comics, not the graphic novel reprints that are behind you on the wall there, look at some of the original printings of the comics. Some of the artists that were still using really, really fine pen lines, I can't think of any names off the top of my head, but there were a few of them. Mike Nasser, for instance, or Marshall Thompson, began to have trouble with the reproduction of their lines. And they would complain, like, why are my lines getting wavy? Joe and Kelly Harris were the ones who explained to us, the plastic plates aren't holding up for the duration of a print run of 200,000, 300,000 comics.
Yeah.
So that's why I really stuck with the brush.
That's neat. That's very cool. I'm super impressed that you guys were doing commercially printed work while you were at school.
Well, I was one of the students who was also I was driven by the fact that I didn't know if I was going to be able to afford to come back to second year.
Yeah.
Right. Like everything was cool with me and my dad now, but I was running out of money. So starting in January of 1977, I was just going into my second semester at the Kubert School. I had just come back to New Jersey from, my parents had moved from Vermont to Florida. They sold the store and the family home, moved to Florida. They told me. They didn't abandon me. And so I came back for that second semester and I was like, I got to start lining up freelance work. Like I got to put my portfolio together and I got to go into the city. So on certain days of the week where I didn't have a class, because once we were seniors, we didn't have quite the full class schedule that we had first semester. I would clear it with Joe and Muriel and I would go into the city for a half day and start, knocking on doors and hitting art directors with my portfolio. And some of my first sales were to Heavy Metal, John Workman up at Heavy Metal. And that's part of why my dad paid for my second year at the Kubert School. Dad could see I was serious. Like I was going out and I was trying to get work. He could see it wasn't going to pay enough, to make a living at it yet. But there I was, carrying as best I could the workload at the school. And Rick Veach properly has, given me a lot of shit, a ration of shit for not always getting my assignments done. But obviously I did well enough that Joe was still giving me work. And I was out there trying to get, freelance work. And it was really John Workman. I mean, I went to Marvel, I went to DC, but the only door that opened up for me initially was John Workman at Heavy Metal. And I sold him 2 one-pagers before I was done with that first year at Kubert School.
And
yeah.
If you remember, I don't know if you remember this level of detail, but what was Heavy Metal paying sort of relative to what you were getting from?
Oh God, it was a fortune by compare.
Yeah.
It was like, it was 100 or 150 a page. You didn't get paid until it got printed though. That was the thing with Heavy Metal. And they could sit on that work a long time, Brian. But yeah, it was like 150 a page. I still have the contracts I can look up. The big difference was the work we did for Joe was work for hire, right? It belonged to Heroes World. It belonged to DC. The work I did for Heavy Metal, it was the first time I ever saw a contract where I owned the work. Actually, no, that's not true. It's the second contract. The other thing that I didn't mention to you is Rick Veach had a connection with a guy named Clifford Neal. And Clifford was in Mystic, Connecticut, and he was publishing an underground called Dr. Wortham's Comics and Stories. Yeah. So at the same time we were at Kubert School doing our assignments, Rick and I both, Rick had already sold the story to Cliff Neal. I sold Cliff one of my assignments from Kubert School. I had done a 2-page story for one of the class assignments. This is it's a little perverse. Dino De Laurentiis' King Kong was about to come out. And I had a 2-page comic story where Dino De Laurentiis gets killed in his projection room by the walking dead corpses of Willis O'Brien, Marion C. Cooper, and Ernest B. Schoedsack, the guys that made the original King Kong, climb out of the grave and kill Dino De Laurentiis. Yeah. That was in Dr. Wortham's Comics and Stories. And Cliff encouraged Rick and I to continue working. We started doing stories together. We did the Telltale Fart for Dr. Wortham's. So Heavy Metal was the second contract I saw where I owned the work. The work Rick and I had done for Cliff Neal, our solo stories, we own the copyright. The stories we did together, we copyrighted as Creative Burnouts. Yeah. Anyway, sorry about that.
And that $150 a page that Heavy Metal was paying, what was that relative to like a DC rate at that time, or DC or Marvel rate? Do you know?
Well, I don't know what their rates were at that time because we were getting Joe's rates, right? We were getting maybe $10 a page.
Right.
Right. And we knew it was student work. We weren't getting what Joe got paid. Right. We were getting, a student share for the work we were doing, but I would guess 10, 20. It wasn't much more than that, but we were happy for it. It was gravy,
Well, when you eventually you would do work at DC that wasn't through the school. So
$45 a page. When I started on Swamp,
paying 2 and 3 times sort of.
Oh yeah. Heavy Metal was way better. And the best pay rate I got was from Scholastic. While I was at the Kubert School, Joe tapped me to do the first freelance story that the Joe Kubert School was going to do for Scholastic magazines. They were launching a new publication called Weird Worlds. Now, this is the year that Star Wars hit, 1977, and Weird Worlds was going to be, it was essentially a monster magazine, more of a science fiction Starlog type magazine for junior high, for schools. And Joe got the contract from, the editors were Bob and Jane Stein. The art director was Bob Feldges. I'm still friends with Bob Feldges on Facebook. And Joe tapped me to do the artwork for that first story, which was called The Villager's Victory. It was in Weird Worlds #1. And I didn't get to put my name on it. It was signed the Joe Kubert School.
Right.
But Joe was very happy with the job I did, and Bob and Jane Stein said, we want more of this. And one of the great gifts of many that Joe gave me is when I graduated, he gave me that contract. I got to continue working freelance with Scholastic, and they paid better than Heavy Metal. They were the best page rate. It was, I think, $200 a page, maybe $225. It was by far the highest rate I was getting, you know. And it wasn't until Epic Illustrated, you know, when Marvel launched Epic Illustrated, and that would have been what, 80?
Something like
1980, 79, 80, somewhere in there. That's when Marvel, you know, had to step up and compete with Heavy Metal rates, because they were trying to win, you know, that niche of the market that Heavy Metal had carved out. When I started on Swamp Thing, Brian, I got $63 a page. Wow. And I believe John Tolobin for the inks was getting $45 a page. And we later found out, you know, 2 years into our run, that we were the lowest page rated DC at that time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, by the end, that was unfortunate. But at the beginning, Swamp Thing was about to be canceled. That's.
Well, not only that, we didn't realize at the time. We didn't find out until 1989, when I had the only phone conversation I ever had with Paul Levitz on a business level, because I knew more about the Return of the Swamp Thing movie than Paul did at that point. So he called. And I was able to ask him why the rates were so low. I was no longer working for DC in '89, so I wasn't shy. And Paul told me, this is verbatim from memory, you know, Paul said something much like, the licensing deal on Swamp Thing was the single worst licensing deal DC had ever made.
Right.
They sold all rights to Melniker and Uslan for the duration of that contract. DC only retained rights to do the comic book. And Melniker and Uslan, who were the production team, they were the ones who produced the Tim Burton Batman movie, but right. Swamp Thing was one of the properties they bought. And when they licensed Swamp Thing, DC had so given up on Swamp Thing. He had even failed as a support character in Challengers of the Unknown prior to that. And they had so given up on Swamp Thing that they only retained the comic book rights. Melniker and Uslan could adapt anything, past, present, or future, from Swamp Thing for their movies and their TV shows. And DC got nothing. That's why when we were on the book, there were no posters, there was no merchandising, there was nothing for a retailer like yourself, unless you bought it through the toy store distributors who had the license, you know, with the toy line and the games and the chalk and the, you know, slippers and all the crazy Swamp Thing stuff they did associated with that failed cartoon show. DC had none of that. And it wasn't until when DC put out that poster that Michael Zulli painted, that famous image of Swamp Thing with the roses growing out of his hands, that was the beginning of the rights having finally reverted to DC, and now they could merchandise all that property.
Interesting. Wow, that's totally stuff I did not know. I did not know any of that. Fascinating. I see that there's some questions there, though. Jordan didn't really flag me, so I don't know if there's anything you want to. They're general. Okay, so we'll keep those in reserve for now. If you have questions and you're watching, please feel free to type them up.
Bring them on. Bring them on.
We'll get to them. Don't worry. Okay, so you came on Swamp Thing, I want to say 16. Is that right?
Yeah. Prior to that, Tom Yates, you know, classmate from the Kubert School. We both graduated spring of '78. Tom Yates was the first Kubert School student to break through doing freelance for DC. And Tom was on Saga of the Swamp Thing right from the beginning. As Tom started the book, it was already behind deadline. Tom started against the 8 ball, and he was also penciling and inking the comic. right?
Yeah.
Himself. So starting with number 2 of Saga of the Swamp Thing, classmates, particularly John Toddleben and Rick Veitch, who were still living in the Dover, New Jersey area. Tom had moved to a really nice place right on Lake Hopatcong in New Jersey. They were pitching in and helping Tom, starting with Saga of the Swamp Thing number 2. And I have to stress to your graphic novel book club members that this was not unusual. Like, we had been housemates since we graduated from the school. The way we all lived and worked together is we would jam when there wasn't paying work and try to, sell stories that we had cooked up. If one of us had a paying gig, all of us would lend a hand. Our role model was the Flegels, right? So Al Williamson, Roy Krenkel, Frank Frazetta, that team of guys from the 50s were very much sort of role models for us, particularly heroes of Tom Yates. So we were really used to pitching in and giving each other a hand. It was just part of how, that's how we all got by. And that was part of the fun of being cartoonists together. So Tom had help from John and Rick off and on, starting with issue 2. The first issue of Swamp Thing, Brian, that you'll find my name snuck into is I laid out Saga of the Swamp Thing number 8. And on the splash page, there's a dinosaur on the splash page. And Tom slipped layouts SRB upside down underneath the dinosaur's tail.
Oh, okay.
It's there, lettered in. And I think the other book that Tom credited us, John and I, on was, I think, number 13. And Tom let us know, right around issue 13, he said, I'm on my way out of here. Like, I've given Len my notice. You guys should try out for this. And we started on the book with issue 16. Yeah. Marty Pasco, the late, great Marty Pasco, he just passed away this past year, unfortunately, was the writer on the book at that time.
Yeah, and the stories were very, very, I don't know, there wasn't much to them in a way.
Well,
right?
There was too much to them in a way. Marty was a very dense writer. I'll give you an example. The first script I got from Marty on Swamp Thing 16, there's a difference between writers who write for comics that they are thinking the way that a writer for television thinks, versus the way a writer who's really grasps and understands the comics medium fully and writes for the artist.
Yeah. And
I can give you a case in point. In that first issue that we did with Marty, on page 2 or 3 or 4, early in the book, Marty called for, in his panel description, having Alec Holland Swamp Thing is opening the grave of Alec Holland. And he's opening the coffin of his departed wife. And Marty instructed me to have the camera, as he put it, above the tree line, and it's raining. But we can see into the coffin, and we can see that the silk has never been laid in.
Okay.
Now, there is no way from 35 feet in the air that visual information can be conveyed in a little panel in a very crowded 7 or 8 panel page. And Marty would do this again and again and again. He would have action in the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. Rather than having the panel as the statement, he would have multiple actions happening in a panel. It's a very dense way of writing, but it's also a very chaotic way of approaching visual storytelling. And Marty's run on the book, he's got a strong following. Tom had done great job on the book. But Tom's frustration was Marty's focus on his human characters kept putting Swamp Thing into the background. Swamp Thing would end up on a train. Swamp Thing would end up in a box. Swamp Thing would end up in a crate, bust out in time to fight off the monster or deal with the menace. And then the beginning of the next issue, he was once again relegated to the background. And it was this sort of, but it was also a school, I'm not going after Marty. It was a school of writing that was very popular at that time because of Chris Claremont and the Uncanny X-Men, right? The top-selling comics like Teen Titans at DC, X-Men at Marvel were very much soap operas.
Sure.
And they were very densely plotted and written.
And it's not necessarily any different than other mainstream, like the Incredible Hulk television show, the Hulk shows up for 10 minutes to fight something, and then that's it.
That's it. But the frustration for those of us who love Swamp Thing was, isn't this supposed to be a monster comic? That was my take anyway. You know.
Yeah. So Alan comes on with 20.
Yeah.
And I have to imagine that his scripts are very, 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 very different than Marty's.
Oh my God. They were night and day. Marty's scripts were very polished. Marty's scripts were presented to us the way that television scripts and feature film scripts are. You know, they were even packaged like that because Marty was writing for Saturday morning cartoons, and that's what his scripts looked like and read like. Alan's script, we could tell right from the first script, from issue 20, because Len, even though I was already penciling 21, while Dan Day was finishing pencils on 20, and John Tolliban was inking 20 and 19 at the same time. That's how close Swamp Thing was to cancellation as well. We were so behind schedule, not necessarily because of Tom Yates. Marty Pascal by that time was phoning in pages. I would get a phone call. Marty would dictate 2 pages to me. I would pencil them. I would have to wait for the next phone call, right? And this was putting the book further and further behind. I was also a slow penciler. It took me 5 weeks to pencil a monthly comic. Do the math, right? Yeah. So it was way behind. And Alan's script, issue 20, was quite dense because Alan was trying to tie up all the loose ends he could from the entirety of the 19-issue Marty Pasco Tom Yates run, and clear the slate so that issue 21 was the beginning of what became the anatomy lesson, a new way of approaching the character.
Yeah.
Alan's scripts, by the way, were exactly what we were praying for. Rick Veitch and I in particular had been brainstorming about what was possible in comics. The day Rick and I met at the Kubert School, we hit it off immediately, not just because we were both from Vermont, and not just because it was Rick Veitch's and Tom Veitch's Two-Fisted Zombies that had convinced me, I could work in this field, because I found out somewhere these two guys were from Vermont, and if they did an underground comic, then I could do an underground comic. And they were from Bellows Falls, and that was a shithole. I knew that, right? So when Rick and I first met, we really bonded. We really connected, and we both wanted to push what was possible in comics, but we didn't have the writing chops. We did not have the writing chops to do what we were conceiving of. And we were trying to get there. And if you read the work that Rick Veitch was doing for Epic Illustrated under the steady stewardship of editor Archie Goodwin, Rick was always pushing the envelope with what was possible, story after story. And then he did Abraxas and the Earthman. Yep. And I had been trying with the work I was doing, especially with, one-offs like Cults, or working with Steve Perry on A Frog Was a Frog, and the Blood Bequest, the Dracula story that Steve and I did at Marvel. How can we push what's possible in the comics medium? And when we saw our first Alan Moore script, we went, this is it. This is exactly what we were trying to do. And Alan was doing it. And Alan was doing it seemingly effortlessly. That first Swamp Thing that Rick, John, myself worked on from an Alan script, issue 21, the anatomy lesson, is a perfectly structured, self-contained issue story. Yeah. It frames itself. It begins where it ends. It ends where it begins. And between that, these characters go through these remarkable arcs, and Alan introduces multitude of new ideas, and it all works.
Yeah.
And that script was a revelation. I mean, part of why I called Rick Veitch immediately when I got the script was, A, I needed help. Okay. And B, he had to read it, because as soon as I read it, I had short hair back then. The hair went up on the back of my neck as I read that script, because it was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And the only time we got to enjoy those comics are when we read those scripts, because after that, it was hard work, right?
Sure. Yeah, Anatomy Lesson is a truly astonishing issue. Not just from all the things that you said, but also that it plays with time in a way you kind of only can in comics.
Well, not only in comics. Both Alan began swapping letters with John Tolliban and I before we had even. Alan, John, and I were swapping letters as I was finishing issue 19 and John was inking issue 20. Okay. And we found out with our first exchange of letters that all three of us were on the same page. And one of the reason I'm bringing it up is one of the connections Alan and I made from the start is I was a huge fan of movies, a devotee and a scholar of movies. And I loved the films of Nicholas Roeg, who was a British director,
Sure.
who at that time had done Performance, Walkabout, Don't Look Now, and The Man Who Fell to Earth. Those were his 4 first films and key films. And Nicholas Roeg had a way of telling a story that would sort of abandon linear narrative and tell the story as if you were doing mosaic tiles. What you would do is you would chart not necessarily the end of the story in terms of a linear narrative, but what was the emotional high point of the story. And you would tell the story from the beginning and the end simultaneously, and you would try to have the reader make the connections in their own imagination that would set off the fireworks by the time you got to your climax.
Sure.
And this was something that, for me, was rooted in the cinema of Nicholas Roeg. For Alan, it was also, he was a devoted reader of, the Jerry Cornelius science fiction novels, Gravity's Rainbow, Thomas Pynchon. Alan was coming from a very literary grounding as well as the cinematic grounding. And for me, it was all about the visual storytelling. And those Nicholas Roeg films were key. And it also meant I drove my editors nuts because I would pencil the pages out of order because Alan was making connections from page to page that weren't necessarily consecutive.
Yeah.
So I would pencil the pages that were companions and turn them in because everybody had the script. John Costanza, the letterer, had the script, and John Totleben had the script, and Len Wein had the script, and once Karen Berger was our editor, starting with issue 25, Karen had the script. So I didn't see why it mattered what order the pages came in. It made better sense for me to work with Alan's mosaic tiles and pencil the pages that were companions so that I was resonating on the visual cues the way Alan was asking us to resonate them in the page itself. Does that make sense at all?
No, that makes perfect sense to me. I could see why that would frustrate an editor.
Yeah, right, because they're not coming in order.
No, it makes sense to me as a creative process.
And all that mattered to me was the creative process.
Yeah. One of the things I was talking about in terms of time is, maybe it's not time, how Woodrue is narrating a thing that is happening somewhere else, and
right.
You're drawing those elements, but they may or may not happen, right?
True.
And even in the story, he gets to a point like, I don't know if this is what happened. It doesn't even really matter what happens as long as he dies,
Right.
And I just had never encountered anything like that in comics before, in terms of, because the thing about comics as opposed to film, right? So Roeg, absolutely a fantastic director. I love those films, but film unfurls at the pace that it's edited at, right? You
True.
As a receiver of film have to receive what you're given. You
right.
can't
right.
stop and go, wait a minute, let me stop for a minute here,
Right.
Especially in pre DVD days.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Prior to VHS, it was impossible to do that,
Yeah,
right?
But even you didn't really want to pause your thing because you'd stretch out the tape and wavy lines on your tape. So
true. Okay.
I think that Alan's understanding of that part of comics is the thing that I always thought was kind of his amazing gift.
Well, it is, but also understand that there were certain key stories that were common touchstones for, I think I'm okay to say, all of us here. And I'll give you just one example, Brian, okay? Now, in terms of mainstream four-color comics, you had writers and artists. Let's go with somebody who was a writer-artist. Jim Starlin played a lot with, time and framing. You look at some of those issues of Warlock in particular, where he really was going out there, in a lot of people talk about those as psychedelic comics, but, they weren't really psychedelic. It was more that Jim Starlin was pushing the envelope about what's possible with fragmenting time to tell a story in the manner he wanted to tell a story. And he was also dealing with these cosmic beings who didn't even live in the time-space continuity we do. For me as a reader, the work that Doug Mensch and Paul Galassi were doing on Master of Kung Fu. Prior, this was still in the 70s when I was a student. They experimented a lot with how do you stretch time? How do you fragment time? How do you break up the narrative? And then there were individual stories that were real landmarks. I hope I get this title correct. I believe the story was called Collector's Item. I could be wrong. It was an Archie Goodwin, Steve Ditko story that was in an early issue of either Creepy or Eerie. And it's the story that involved a jewel. And it was a guy who becomes obsessed with this jewel to the point where he kills the jeweler who has this precious occult gem. And at the bottom of every page, Steve Ditko had this pair of eyes that were open and that were gradually closing on each page until you got to the end of the story and you realized what you were seeing on every page was the last moments of the character's life as his eyes were closing in death because of what happens in the story. So we had seen individual works of comics that had pushed it, but Alan really had mastered it in a way where every single issue that we did together, he was changing it up. He had another approach. He had a fresh orientation. It was incredible. It was incredible.
Yeah. And he also just had such a gift for words and language and creating texture. 30 years later, I can still vividly remember the line about the sunset, and the bayou that looks like the sky had slit its wrists,
Right.
Wow, like what an image! Like if I had read that in a novel, that would have been just a perfect little chestnut. And to encounter in a comic, you never got dialogue like that.
Well,
or descriptive,
sure, but even more importantly, and the things that people don't talk about, and particularly, I read almost all the academic texts because I've been working as an educator for 15 years. I've been very steeped in the academia of comics as well. And there's a lot of academia out there about Alan Moore, trust me.
Sure. Yeah.
And what they don't get, because they're writers, they're not artists. What they don't get, by and large, is the other thing that Alan did that very few other writers had ever done in comics is he engaged all the reader's senses. Okay?
Yeah.
In Swamp Thing 29, the Love and Death issue, the one that we lost the comics code on. Okay?
Yep.
Alan sets up at the beginning on the first page a smell, that there's a smell. There's some odor that Abby can't identify, that the house reeks of, and that she can't get out of her clothes or her skin or her hair. She just smells it. And it's not until the end of the issue that Alan comes back to it, and it's the smell of an ant roasting under a magnifying glass, right? Yeah. It's the smell of an insect's body crisping. And he's engaged your sense of smell. And the other thing Alan does in that same script, in that same issue, is he also sets up this visual mystery that is not overt at any time in the text. Okay? And it's that the mystery of what is reanimating the dead. And at the end of the story, Swamp Thing is walking along and he sees a bird lying on the swamp, on the grass. And it seems to be moving, and he reaches down to pick it up because he thinks it's injured. And as he picks it up, he realizes it's not injured, it's dead. And why is it moving? There's maggots inside of it. And this is how Alan cues the reader that it's insects, which we have now visually associated with arcane, that are the reanimating agent. This is smart comic book writing. This is engaging the reader's tactile senses, the sense of smell. Alan always, without being particularly showy about it, I didn't think anyway, would engage the reader on levels that used to being engaged in most comic stories.
Yeah, no, very, very, very much so. How much did you understand what he was doing with and to the book and the character?
Oh, we knew intimately what Alan was doing. He would tell us in these long, when we were exchanging letters, Brian, some of Alan's letters were 12, 13, 15 pages long, right?
Okay.
And they were single spaced, using the same typewriter. Alan only had one typewriter. There were certain keys that were always misaligned. I can recognize an Alan Moore letter or script from that time just from across the room. And we were also...
Hold on half a second. Because we have a couple of pages of
Yeah,
correspondence.
I have provided you some stuff.
Just as a,
Yeah, let's get into this. Let's share this with...
put up a piece of correspondence?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, folks. One of the perks of being in the Comics Experience graphic novel book club is you are now privy to material that has been unseen by the human eye other than my own and, a couple of friends and guests. This is a passage from one of Alan's letters to me. This is from September of 1984. Alan is writing about what was going to be Swamp Thing number 29. Karen Berger was our editor at this point. Len Wein edited Saga of the Swamp Thing from issue 1 to issue 24. Karen Berger took over the book with issue 25. So Karen is the editor. At this point in time, Alan had turned in a finished script for what was going to be Swamp Thing number 29, the Nuke Face Papers Part 1 of a two-parter. And this is Alan in the letter letting me know that he had been trying to reach Karen. He didn't know what she thought of the Nuke Face story. We were so behind the eight ball that Alan, was hoping it was working. And I sent this material to you, Brian, so you could share with the book club members how Swamp Thing 29 came about. So at this point in time, it was supposed to be Nuke Face Part 1. I'll also add here for the benefit of your graphic novel book club members, Nuke Face was a character that Alan Moore did not create. Nuke Face was a character that John Toddleben had created a couple of years before any of us were ever working on Swamp Thing. Yeah. John did this drawing when we were all sharing the house in New Jersey. And it was this wino who had this skeletal face, and he had a can that was steaming. And John said, "Yeah, that's Nuke Face. He drinks toxic waste." And we all laughed, And we held on to that idea, and it was one of the story ideas that we pitched to Alan Moore as soon as Alan was on the book. Neat. So let's go to the next correspondence. This is a letter from the next month, early October of 1984. And as you can see, I'll be talking over this as you're reading it, but give this a read as I'm talking. Alan has found out between the time he mailed me the prior letter and I got this letter, that he had to completely rewrite Swamp Thing 29. One of the skill sets of an editor is that Karen Berger had her pulse on the readership in a way that none of us did. And Karen read Nuke Face Papers Part 1 and went, "This is a really good story. This is a really good script. I can see that Steve and John are going to do a good job with it, but we're picking up circulation right now. And it's too," I think Karen's word was funereal, an issue. It was too slow paced an issue. Karen wanted a knock 'em dead horror comic. Now, from the first paragraph here, imparting my subdued belch there, from the first paragraph, you can see Alan and I are commiserating. We're both feeling pretty burnt out at this time in 1984. I will add that Alan and his first wife, Phyllis, they had 2 kids, 2 daughters, Amber and Leah. And at this time in my life, my first child, my first wife, Marlene O'Connor, and I had our first child, Maya Rose. Hi, Maya. God bless you. Maya was now a year old, and Alan and I were both burnt out, both with trying to stay on top of deadlines and with being fathers. and this was completely new to me, being a dad. So we commiserate a little bit, and here's Alan listing all the other work he's doing while writing Swamp Thing, which is why I excerpted this letter for you. The other thing people forget when they look at this work is this was part of a workflow. Alan would write an issue of Swamp Thing within a few days, but he had other work at the time. Here he is saying he's done 2 episodes of DR and Quinch, which was a series he was doing for 2000 AD, a weekly comic in England. 1 episode of the Ballad of Halo Jones, another 2000 AD comic he was doing. Synopsis for a planned top secret Batman Judge Dredd crossover, which obviously didn't happen with Alan. 8 pages of sample dialogue for the same book he was auditioning. An episode of V for Vendetta, a Bo Jeffrey saga. Those were both for Warrior magazine, which was still being published. Marvel Man, still being published by Warrior. Swamp Thing 29. He had to rewrite Swamp Thing 29. He was also doing...
I love that. That's great.
Yeah, and he was... Okay. Then he had to rewrite Swamp Thing 29, and you can see Alan's wording here. Having to rewrite 29 was a real fucking bastard. He did it in about 2 days flat. Alan pulled that issue of Swamp Thing out of his ass, pardon my French.
Wow.
And I got the script, and it was the single most horrific comic script I had ever read in my life, and I couldn't wait to draw it. I was like, oh my God, this is it. This is the horror comic I've been dreaming about since I dropped that issue of Skull #6 on the ground. Let's go to the next page here. Yeah. Okay, same letter a little later. So he's apologizing for Swamp Thing 29, the script. I had to rush it through in 3 days in order to keep within any sort of schedule at all. He wasn't sure whether it worked or not. He was confident John and I could make it work. Then Alan gets into where we wanted to go. The Swamp Lust story, by the way, he's referring there to, I had written Alan a postcard, not even a letter, a postcard. I had just finished penciling the issue before the annual. And I sent Alan a postcard saying, you know, if Abby Cable was a real woman, she would be in a mental asylum by now. Why don't we do one issue where Swamp Thing and Abby just have a good day together in the swamp? Nothing happens. No monsters, no evil villain. And Alan immediately fell in love with the idea and began to call it the Swamp Lust issue. And that's what became the Rites of Spring, Swamp Thing 34, our romance issue, our psychedelic romance issue. You can also see Alan referring to a Patchwork Man story, which in the end he didn't do. I ended up writing a Patchwork Man story later when I was scripting and Rick Veitch was penciling fill-in issue. And here's Alan talking about the elevation of Swamp Thing to a swamp god, how he sees this gradual elemental side of Swamp Thing going. And I love his last line, which is why I included it here. We'll do something that'll make the Evil Dead look like a Frank Capra film.
That's great.
Well, it turned out it was that issue he didn't think was very good that created all the hubbub. Shall we go to the next one? Okay, and this I included for your book club members because here's Alan talking very openly about the kind of conversations he was having with DC at that time. He is reasserting to me in the letter that Swamp Thing comes first, but let's face it, you know, not just his schedule was heating up, but Alan was beginning to move toward the kind of autonomy as a writer that would allow him to work on projects like Watchmen, for instance, where John and I could not. Because John and I, it was all we could do to pencil and ink a monthly comic, Swamp Thing. Alan could script Swamp Thing in a week. That meant most months he had 3 other weeks to work on other projects. And this is part of the economics of creating periodical comics that people who are not on the creative side don't think about. That when a writer gets hot, they're able to move. They're able to build with that momentum. They're able to stretch their wings and fly. Whereas the artists are really tied to whatever the book is that they're doing. And that, you know, trying to do pinch work or fill-in work or, you know, even accept phone calls from other opportunities when you begin to get some momentum in the field is impossible. And in fact, your editor is actively discouraging you even thinking about other work. So that's why I included this. I also wanted people to understand that DC realized as early as Swamp Thing 29, hey, this Alan Moore, this is something. We've got somebody here doing something no one's done before for us.
Yeah. Give us the next page.
Shall we go to the next?
Yep.
Here's how Alan would talk to John and I about our work. I won't read this, but, you know, we would be... the only way we could get our work into Alan's hands was when... And think about this. I'm living in the backwoods of Vermont. So whenever I'm going to go out and put out a FedEx or a UPS package of pencils to my editor, I have to first go to a photocopy store and I have to photocopy my pencils. And I have to pay for photocopies. So I have a set. John Totleben gets a set in the mail and we mail a set to Alan. And this is money that's not being reimbursed by DC.
Wow.
So we're getting the lowest page rate that they pay and we're subsidizing the work while doing all this additional driving. I mean, for me to FedEx a package out, Karen would call and say, Steve, whatever you got, FedEx it out. That was a lost work day for me, right? I have to leave my house, bundle up Maya, take her with me, carry her with me everywhere I go, and I'm out of the studio for the day. And I won't even get into trying to pencil a monthly book while home with a 1-year-old child, okay? Because my wife had a full-time job at that time. So we're sending Alan our pencils. And by this time, he'd seen the pencils to number 27, which was the end of the Demon story, the 3-issue arc. And he's just writing issue 31, and he's already thinking about the annual. So we had to be juggling all these balls, Brian, at the same time, right? And as we got further into this, we're still writing letters to each other, but we would occasionally brave a phone call. But phone calls, AT&T, long distance to Erie, Pennsylvania, where John Tolliban lived, long distance to Northampton, England, you can imagine what my phone bills were every month.
Very, very expensive, yes.
Yep, and DC would not reimburse this. Eventually, we hit the point where we were plotting or co-plotting so many issues that John and I asked, hey, can we get credit for the plots? And DC would barter, well, how about we reimburse your phone bill? Because they were cultivating Alan Moore as their hot new writer. Right. And this became part of the economy behind the scenes that was allowing us to continue work on the book.
Interesting.
Let's go.
Yep.
Okay, and this is the end of that letter. I want to include the sign-off. Your partner in pernicious pictorial perversion.
Love it.
Alan was really enjoying working with John and I, and we were really pushing the envelope as best we could. And you noticed Alan said, let's hope nobody tries to fuck with you and John on the art side. And I included this letter because guess what? Right when I got this letter is when Alan's 3-day pinch hit script lost us the comics code. Let's go to there's another image that you have. If you want to go there, Brian, it's up to you.
Sure, please. What do you do?
Okay, so this is the beginning of Swamp Thing 29. I'm not going to read this to your readers. They can read it. It's in the Swamp Thing volumes that you're selling as part of the book club, correct?
This is not in volume 1. This will be in
volume 2, right? Yeah. Yep. Okay, so volume 2. So if you bought volume 1 with the signed book plates, which I signed in person, also order volume 2 from Brian as well. This is the beginning of the Swamp Thing 29 that lost us the comics code. And Alan's script called for a 6-panel grid. Now, when you think 6-panel grid in an Alan Moore script, think Watchmen, okay? Dave Gibbons and Alan worked with a very linear, regimented, the grid of the page as their pacing. You know, it was very metronomic almost, very deliberately so. I hated the grid. I hated the comics grid. And for me doing horror comics, a comics grid means stability. Destabilizing that grid is part of the emotional power that I can bring to the page to knock you off your comfort level, to knock you off your equilibrium. I want to keep the reader off balance. I don't want this to be a comfortable read for you. Okay. Now, the other reason I shifted the grid on this page 1, and the reason I'm showing you page 1 is it leads into what we're going to show you next, is to give you an example of here's what a script looks like. Here's what we did. Let's go back to page 1 for just a second more. Go back 1. Okay. So Alan had a 6-panel grid, and at the bottom of the 6th panel, he wanted that wire brush, and he wanted the reader to be able to see the wire brush in the foreground and Abby in the background. And he wanted the reader to be able to see little dewdrops of blood on the wire brush, and that Abby's shoulder was bloody. Now, if I had gone with a standard 6-panel grid, the wire brush would have been too small, and that detail would not have been visible to the reader. It's not that different from the Marty Pasco panel I described to you, where you're supposed to be above a tree line, looking down into an open grave in a rainstorm, and yet recognize that the silk had never been laid in. By sticking to Alan's script religiously, there is a 6-panel grid here. But by blowing up the 6th panel and expanding it into a larger panel than the other 5, I can foreground and enlarge that wire brush. So it's the object, the focal object of this entire page. And now, by getting rid of the panel borders on that 6th panel, I have opened up the breathing space of that page. Okay?
Can I ask just because I'm going to be a pesky little person here? Doesn't this break a rule in terms of the Z that the eye is meant to follow?
Nope, because the other thing that's leading your eye, Brian, are the captions. And when I penciled Swamp Thing, I placed all the captions, right?
Okay, I was going to ask that question. in another context.
Right, right. But I'm going to now, some point early in my career, I remember I used to go to a lot of comic conventions. When we were doing Swamp Thing, John and I were either at a comic book signing or a convention literally every other weekend because retailers like you, Brian, would fly us out to their stores, right? Or conventions would invite us, and John and I didn't have the money to do it, but they would fly us out to their convention, right? And the retailers were supporting not just the book, but our ability to do the book. Now, the reason I'm talking about conventions always had a break room, you know, a place where kids could get soda or you could just go and sit. And without being creepy or a stalker, I started to get in the habit of watching people who sat down with their comics, and I was trying to track their eyes as they were reading their comics. And there's three ways that people read comics. There are text-oriented people who open a comic book page and you can see their eyes. They read every caption and every balloon, and then they go back and scan the page visually. Then there's visually oriented people who turn the page in the comic and they drink in both pages visually, and then they go back and they take their time and they read every text, caption, and word balloon. And then there's those people that open the comic and they're very regimented in how they read it. They don't look at anything except panel 1 on the first page, and they go in order. So I have to design this page, Brian, so that all three orientations to reading comics will follow the reading pattern I want them to follow.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, one of those tools is how we place the captions and word balloons. And from issue 16, I was penciling, John Costanza was lettering. I knew the sizing of John Costanza's lettering, so I would actually place every caption balloon, and I would lightly, with a 4H pencil, letter in the script so that I knew exactly how much space on that, in that panel, on that page, the lettering would take.
Interesting.
And John did not complain. John Costanza liked that I did that. And for me as the penciler, it meant that I wasn't wasting time penciling something that was going to get covered up with a caption or a balloon, right? That's a waste of time. Every inch of this page is time spent at the board. So determining right from the get-go where the captions are is a time-effective device. But more importantly, I lead your eyes with the placement of the captions. I try to make it so there's only one way to read this page, regardless of whether you're visually oriented, text-oriented, or you are driven by the panel placement. So all the captions are on the top of the top tier of panels, and nothing leads your eye unless I want to pull it down. Look at the first panel. The angle on the couch and the coffee table pulls your eye over to panel 2. That pink stream that you don't know what it is at this point, it's an odor, brings your eye down. And then I place those bottles, they lay in such a way as to pull your eye over to panel 3, but one of the broken bottles down at the bottom pulls your eye down toward the bottom tier. Then the placement of the captions again in panel 4, 5, and 6, pull your eye down to Abby and then the brush.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So, and I try to break that Z. Not everyone reads with that Z pattern. So I'm trying to lead your eye. All right. That was a great question. Thank you, Brian. Nobody asked about this stuff.
Absolutely. These are the things that I love about comics, and I love about the language of comics so much. How much, Jordan, get back to screens with us just for a minute.
Okay.
How much, in terms of your layouts when you're penciling, how much of it is done in thumbnail versus done live on the page?
We did it all thumbnails. The way we were trained by Joe Kubert at the Kubert School, not just Joe, Dick Giordano, Rick Estrada, Lee Elias, these are all very seasoned vet, golden age to bronze age cartoonists. And we were taught to do your thumbnails first. You can destroy the page and waste a great deal of time by trying to lay it out on the board, right? So what you do is you work with your thumbnails, and then you go to tracing paper. Once you get confident, the further I got into doing Swamp Thing, I could very confidently go from thumbnail to the Bristol board, because in my thumbnail, I had solved most of the problems. It was also, just the way I'm wired, Brian. If I try to redo a drawing, loses life every time. So I try to retain the spontaneity of the initial drawing. I do not lose that spontaneity working thumbnails. It's when I go to what's going to be my finished page that I try to maintain that spontaneity. If I have any concerns about that, I'll go from thumbnail to tracing paper. And the beauty of tracing paper is you can cut, you can tear, you can repaste. You're using Scotch tape, and then you can put it on a light board, lay your Bristol board over it, and you've worked out all the nuances of size, proportion, direction, whatever it is you're struggling with on that particular page. But by this time, and in part because we're so behind schedule, I'd gotten pretty good about thumbnails to Bristol board, get it done, get it out.
Yeah. So you're solving the lettering problems then too.
I am. Yeah. Tell you, I hated working Marvel. I hated working Marvel method. I worked Marvel method. I did a fair amount of work for Marvel. Not a lot, but a fair amount of work for Marvel between 1978 and 1983. Okay. And Marvel method, I hated because you would finish a page and you had no idea what the writer was going to do. Yeah. And then I wouldn't see it until it was printed. And it was like the editor or the writer editor were placing the balloons and captions, and it would pull your eye all over the page. It would destroy the ability to read the page comfortably. For me, the placement of lettering, the captions, the balloons, the sound effects is integral to everything about the design of the page and the storytelling, not just the design elements, but the actual storytelling, right? Yeah. So that's why by the time I was doing Swamp Thing in 83, I mean, I'd been working professionally by this point for, 8 years. Well, no, 7 years, and that's a fair amount of pages I had under my belt. And with a lot of my work, the lettering, Rick Veitch would letter the pages. He'd get paid for the lettering, but I had gotten used to placing balloons and captions and knowing the size and the flow of Rick Veitch's lettering. And Rick, of course, was very used to working with mine. And we had both been trained by Joe. It was very much the Joe Kubert school of page design and lettering.
Interesting. Okay. Let's go.
Let's go to the next page. Okay. So now what I want to show, and I will emphasize again, you members of the Comics Experience Graphic Novel Book Club. Here's a privileged view of a script that nobody has seen outside of my classroom, and John Tollivan, Rick Veitch, and I, and the editors at DC, and of course, Alan Moore. This is what Alan wrote that he wanted page 2 of this issue to be. He wanted a full page splash, okay? Now, when it says full page splash, that means a vertically oriented panel, okay? So it would be a rectangle. Symbolic fantasy image of Abby's unconscious mind. Somewhere in the middle, Abby floats, naked and in the same fetal posture, her white hair drifting out around her, a thin line of blood trickling from the scrub patch on her shoulder all around her. All around her are images of filthy, disgusting, bug-infested evil. I won't describe it any more fully than that, except to note that I see the coloring of the bug imagery as being composed more or less of browns and rusts and sepias and yellows. This is pretty specific art direction from a writer, but John and I love this stuff. John, Rick, and I love this stuff because this is like food for a cartoonist of our mindset. Let's go to the next page. This is the rest of his description of page 2. Other than that, draw it how you will. I would not presume for one moment to instruct 2 modern masters of filthy, disgusting, bug-infested evil, such as yourselves, upon the fine details of a scene like this. And then Alan goes a little further, and he refers to an Art Spiegelman strip in Arcade. Now, Alan knew I was a fan of Arcade. I bought every issue of Arcade as it came out. Brian, do you want to tell your audience what Arcade was?
Arcade was a ground level magazine, I guess I would call it. Put it out originally. I actually don't remember that.
Well, it was edited by Art Spiegelman and Bill Griffith. That's what's important. And it was Art Spiegelman and Bill Griffith going, this is the best of the underground. And Arcade pretty much ended the initial underground comics movement. I mean, it was...
But it's funny because I would really consider that ground level rather than underground. Personally.
Yeah, but there was strong work in there that wouldn't have been possible in, say, Comics Book, the underground that Dennis Kitchen edited for Marvel. So here's Alan, as he would sometimes do, referring to something in the pop culture, in this case, an Art Spiegelman strip in Arcade, in which Spiegelman had cockroaches running around the page. And this is what Alan's calling for. Now, one thing I'll give you as a bit of technical information, we could not do full bleeds in 4-color comics. Yeah. We could do the gutter bleed, We're going to show you a double page spread in just a moment. Don't put it up yet. Stay with the script page right now. But you could not draw the bugs going off the top and sides and bottom of the page because it wasn't possible with the way comics were printed. That had to be blank page. So John and I had to, how can we work with this? You'll notice there's only one caption on this splash page. She could smell it in her dreams. This is Alan kicking in the reader's sense of smell, as I mentioned to you earlier, Brian, in our conversation. And then the credits. Now let's look at the 2-page spread. So I would always follow Alan's scripts, but I had license from Alan to do whatever would work best. So what I did is Alan had called for page 3, which would have been the facing right-hand page, to be a 5-panel page. And all that happens on page 3 is Abby and Swamp Thing are talking in the swamp. It's not as visually important as that fetal, curled over in a fetal position Abby, who has been traumatized. Now, we are still drawing a mainstream 4-color comic book. We are still working under the restrictions of the Comics Code Authority. Alan has instructed us that Abby is nude, but we cannot draw a nude woman the way that, say, Vertigo could in the 90s.
Yeah. So
I carefully draw Abby's figure so that there are no breasts showing, no pubic hair showing, no ass showing, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll notice what I did is I turned Alan's vertical page 2 into 2/3 of a double page spread. I wanted to maximize the impact of that splash page. I wanted this to horrify the reader and pull you right into the story. Also, Brian, when I would design these splash pages, I would hand letter what John Costanza would then trace. And that lettering font that says Swamp Thing and Love and Death, you know where I got that from?
No.
That's the lettering that was used by the United Artists promotional team for the posters for A Fistful of Dollars and A Few Dollars More. I always loved that lettering that was on those 2 Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns. And if you look at the comics I did, Swamp Thing and Tyrant, that's the lettering font that I would often use in comic jobs. Nobody else uses it. And I think it's a fantastic font. It's got this really creepy, rough-hewn feel to it. And because of Alan's instructions about bugs, I mean, we knew we couldn't go outside the bleed. So I drew the bugs as the break between our credits. And now when I also notice how I worked in Alan's caption for the splash page, I have Abby looking out, like staring into space. And then her profile, as if she turned her head down, is what pulls the reader into the flashback. That's an outline of her in profile down. And I set Alan's caption into the negative space of the page. Positive and negative space on a page is very important. And pulling captions out of caption boxes and putting them in negative space like I did here, and then putting them as white lettering on black, as we did on Swamp Thing's figure on the first panel of the flashback, is a very effective tool as well. And then if you look, I'm sorry, go ahead, Brian.
I was going to ask, is that a concern in terms of what your reproduction was?
Yes, yes. John Costanza would have to do the lettering with a heavier lettering nib when it was going to be reversed white on black, because you didn't want the lettering to close up, okay? Yeah. And so John Costanza would have to use a heavier nib on that lettering for the lettering that's inside of the silhouette of Swamp Thing in that, I'll call it panel 2.
Yeah,
the first panel.
I mean, it was shitty newsprint back then.
Oh yeah, but we all knew it was shitty newsprint back then. Yeah. And one of the problems with the reprint editions, and this is one of the things that one of the reasons I would urge people who are really serious about studying the work we did is try to get your hands on the original printings, because we were drawing for newsprint, and Tatiana Wood in particular was coloring from newsprint. Tatiana colored these pages knowing that the newsprint was going to drink much of the color, that it was going to lose value in hue. And so when they reproduced these in the reprint, the paperbacks, the colors look too bright because they're still using Tatiana Wood's color guides, but those color guides were intended for newsprint, which was going to degrade, say, a full yellow-red, a bright YR in the coding that we used back in those days. YR would mean yellow-red combined. It was going to knock it back to the color red you see here on Abby's, back portion and the blood on her shoulder.
Yeah. I want to sidebar here for a second.
Yeah.
Say, just how good Tatiana Wood is.
Oh, Tatiana Wood, master.
The coloring on these it's just crazy. I'm thinking of things like, like the planarian worm sequence when it's like a blue surprint. And when you think how few color are actually involved here.
Yeah.
It's not like digital coloring today where you have the entire rainbow available to you.
No.
It's just the combinations of yellow, blue.
It's yellow, blue, red, and black.
And that's it. And that's
it. That's all you have to work with. And all the gradations of that in certain harmonies, certain combinations that were permitted. And Tatiana was a master at it. Now, when you see a surprint, which is what you were referring to in that sequence in the anatomy lesson, that would mean that John Toddleman and I figured out the color, and then John actually inked it on a separate layer of acetate, Brian.
Oh, wow.
Okay. And we would put instructions saying this should only be printed with the cyan plate, cyan being blue. Okay. And we would include that instruction on the black and white artwork as well. And the editor makes sure that Tatiana saw that. So Tatiana knew, Steve and John did a surprint here. Okay. In fact, I can walk you through a surprint when we get to the second double page spread up from that issue of Swamp Thing.
Yeah. How often are you indicating color choices?
Very rare. Yeah. Very rare. We trusted Tatiana. I'll tell you, when we were students at the Joe Kubert School, it was before John Toddleman was at the school. It was the first year we were at the school. And I cannot remember if it was during class time or if it was after hours, because a lot of times Joe would come out of his studio and walk around the tables when we were working after hours. And we worked, till 1, 2 in the morning at the school. Joe once went over an entire issue of Sergeant Rock that Tatiana had colored, and he showed us all the subtleties and nuances that Tatiana had worked into that issue of Sergeant Rock. And I can even tell you which issue of Sergeant Rock it was. It was the issue of Sergeant Rock where on the cover, he's World War II GI on one side and he's a caveman on the other side. And it was one of those Robert Kanigher scripts that showed, Rock in battle during World War II, cross-cut with the life of a caveman, battling dinosaurs and other cavemen and stuff. And Joe walked Rick Veach and I and whatever other classmates were there through every page of that issue and made us see, look at what Tatiana did. Look at this subtlety. Look at this yellow outline at the edge of the panels that are in the prehistoric past. So the reader knows this is a different time frame than during World War II. Yeah. And so we were attuned to what a master artist Tatiana Wood was as a colorist before we ever got to work with her. And being able to work with, Tatiana Wood as our colorist, John Costanza as our letterer, we knew who these people were. We had never met them, but we knew who they were. We knew how long they worked in the field. We knew what consummate professionals they were, what artists they were. And, it's one of the reasons I do love the Absolute editions. The big hardcover Absolute editions are gorgeous. And the new coloring job, by and large, I'm quite pleased with. But it's like a heartbreaker that one of our team members, Tatiana Wood, sort of got ripped out of the teamwork. Yeah. But, such is reprint media.
Yeah. Like we were talking earlier about things that happen in later books. I don't know where it is. It's like 4 or 5, something like that. There's an issue, I think Rick drew that one, where they're in outer space.
Everything's blue.
Everything's blue. It's called My Blue Heaven.
Yeah.
And that she's able to color an entire issue using nothing but blue, and it works. It's really like, I don't know, if that someone did that today, they would be winning Eisner Awards just for that.
Yeah. I mean, Tatiana was one of the greatest artists who ever worked in mainstream comic books in North America, period. And she's gotten very little attention or credit for it. People do sing the praises of Marie Severin, justifiably. And Marie, with her coloring goes back to the heyday of the EC Comics, 1951 to 55. And Marie, I did meet her at Marvel, and Marie was head of the production department through the 70s at Marvel and beyond. But Tatiana was just as consummate an artist. And because we never saw her put pen to paper the way we saw Marie Severin put pen to paper, she tends to be overlooked. But Tatiana is just a master.
Absolutely. Do you want to go back to?
Yeah. Let's go back to. So let's take a look at the next visual.
Okay.
Now, this is the end of that issue of Swamp Thing. This is the page that lost us the Comics Code Authority seal of approval. Okay. Why do you think it lost us the Comics Code seal of approval, Brian Hibbs?
It's not the zombies, is it?
Well, they started with the zombies. Yeah. It was actually the flies, first of all.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So get a panic phone call from Karen Berger. The Comics Code has refused the issue. And so I said, okay, what's the problem? And she said, well, the zombies, and you drew them with flies. And, we may have to take the flies out. And I went, well, you can't, because it's a story point, right? The corpses are reanimated by insects. We have to draw the flies. We weren't being gratuitous. And this turned into one of those surreal, insane arguments you have on the phone with an editor sometimes. And I won the argument. I was FedExing pages out that very day to Karen. I was already working on the annual, the pencils for the annual. And I opened up our local Massachusetts. I lived in Vermont, but we were in southern Vermont. So I would occasionally get the Springfield, Massachusetts newspaper, the Sunday Republican, because that's where I could find out what was playing at the movie theaters down in Massachusetts, which was in driving distance. And lo and behold, in a family paper that's called the Sunday Republican, there are 2 ads for 2 brand new Italian zombie movies that are opening at the drive-ins. And they have zombies. And one of them has flies. And I cut out the ad and I stuck it in the package with my pencil pages with a note to Karen saying, if the flies are good enough for the Sunday Republican, what's the code problem? Okay. And I FedEx it to Karen, and because the conversation continued over a few days. Then we never had a conversation with the code. Like, I have no idea who the code is, Brian, right? There was no conversation with the code. We were never even given a copy of the Comics Code. Then the code read the issue.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's very interesting that you didn't even know what the Comics Code entailed. I mean,
the only Comics Code
was decades later that I found out. But that's why I answered zombies, because I knew that the Comics Code explicitly outlawed zombies.
Prior to 1969, when they revised the code, they allowed The Walking Dead in the classic tradition of Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, and Saki.
Yeah.
So that was the wording when they changed it. So we were okay drawing The Walking Dead, but you couldn't be too gruesome, right? This broke the code. Reference to you could not be too gruesome.
Right. Well, that the reason that the code existed in the first place in many ways was to put EC out of business.
Yeah, they wanted EC out of business. They wanted William Gaines gone. And so they basically outlawed everything that was in every EC free-code horror comic ever. Right. Yeah. Including some of the words that he used, right? Yeah. So, and that code was strictly adhered to by all but 2 publishers. Yeah. Gilberton, Classics Illustrated, because they never subscribed to the code, and Dell. Okay. Yeah. So
both
unimportant in our conversation, but so the code had been revised.
Dell did Disney Comics, so they're obviously not going to break the,
Sure, but this is why in the early 60s, Dell was the only comic book publisher who could license the Universal monsters and put out comic books of Frankenstein, the Mummy, Dracula, and the Creature, when the other publishers could not, because they were forbidden.
I'll also sidebar that this is the reason that the 1970s Marvel comics, when they had zombies, they called them Zoovembies.
Yes,
as a way to get around the Comics Code. As long as you didn't call it a zombie, call it a Zoovembi, it was okay.
Right. And the only way I knew about the code, Brian, is I had a copy of that Les Daniels book, Comics. Right. That beautiful hardcover book that Les wrote, the late, great Les Daniels, who was a friend of mine, thankfully. So let's go back to the spread. There's a couple other things I'll point out to your members. So then the code read the book. And look at the word balloon. Just say uncle. This is the moment when Abby finds out her dead husband is possessed by the spirit of her uncle Arcane, which John Toddleben and I represent visually with that red Sir print behind them. And this is all penciled on a double-page spread of illustration board. But John Toddleben inked that entire top third of the panel on a layer of acetate.
Interesting.
Okay. And when the code read the issue, they went, oh my God, this is incest. You can't have this. And Alan Moore famously said, well, growing up with the royal family, I didn't see the problem. And that didn't carry any weight with the code. And what happened, I won't go into all the details, but Dick Giordano was away on vacation at the time. This was a huge embarrassment for Karen Berger, right? This is a sudden shitstorm in the DC offices with the code. But there's no time to make us change the issue. We are so far behind the 8 ball. I'm already penciling a double annual, and Karen's trying to keep me on schedule. And this is when we started having fill-in artists. Rick Veitch penciled an issue that John Taliban inked, and I had already penciled an issue that Alfredo Alcala was inking while I was penciling the annual. So there was no time to fix this issue. That's why the decision was made, put it out without the code.
Yeah.
But this put Karen Berger on the hot seat. And what was wonderful is retailers like you, Brian, got this book in and spread the word. Oh my God, Swamp Thing lost the comics code. And sales went up. This increased our visibility in sales.
Nice.
Thank you.
Nice. Yeah. This is before my time. I opened my store in 1989. So,
well,
you know,
it was retailers like you. So,
yeah. In fact, the very first order form I turned in was had the first printing of
the paperback. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That
means you had to choose between the DC trade or the Warner Books trade. Because they had different covers.
Well, we did the DC, yeah. And I think it was something like the 4th or 5th trade paperback that DC had prints.
Yeah, Sandman is what they started with.
Yeah.
I believe.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Exactly. Okay, is there more you want to show us here with that?
Sure, bring on. We'll do a little more show and tell, and you tell me how far you want to go with this. So I just wanted to show your book club members, this is how we did covers, okay? On the left is cover rough that I did in pencil on a piece of vellum, it looks like to me. And this is when our buddy Tom Yates, the original artist on Saga of the Swamp Thing, was still doing covers. DC liked to carry the continuity when they would change art teams on a book. They would try to keep the prior artist or art team doing covers for a few issues, so it was transitional. So Tom was still doing the covers. This was Tom's last cover, actually. So I sent in a number of thumbnails like this one, and this is the one that Len Wein chose. Len was still the editor. This was the last issue that Len edited. And you can see how closely Tom Yates stuck to my thumbnail. And this is a tiny thumbnail. I mean, this is like, I don't know, 5 inches by 2 inches at the most, that drawing on the left. And this is a cover I hated designing because this is when we brought in the Justice League. And I was so against bringing in superheroes that Len Wein and Alan Moore agreed to tell me that Len Wein had made Alan do it. Right. So that it wouldn't be like bust up the team. I wouldn't be mad at Alan.
Yeah.
But really, Alan did want, Justice League in the book.
But wouldn't you agree that that in a lot of ways bringing in those mainstream DCU elements? I mean, obviously, Anatomy Lesson starts with the Floronic Man, right? He was Justice League villain.
Floronic Man's a monster.
Well, sure, right, but it's still the DC Universe elements, and I would argue that that's one of the things that allowed a lot of readers to go, I can read this book.
Okay, but let me give.
It was always a weird little book that took place in its own little thing, and I don't think we talk enough about the impact of continuity on what readers decide is real or not.
Continuity was the issue for me. I already was seeing what was happening with continuity at DC and Marvel. Let me put on my reader's cap for a moment, right? The moment I got the script with the Justice League, I went, holy shit. This is like when Marvel made Jack Kirby put the Hulk in the Eternals. And it was the end of the Eternals after that, right? We weren't done. I just felt like we were, warming up. I understand all the arguments you're making, but you have to understand that I was on a mission from God, and my mission was to bring back horror comics.
Yeah. And
bring in the Justice League was contrary to that. In fact, I was so against it that Rick Veitch came down and penciled Superman and Green Lantern in that issue.
Okay.
Because I was so disgusted that I had to draw Superman and Green Lantern. And I understand how nuts that sounds because most cartoonists wanting to get into the comic book field would kill to be drawing Green Lantern or Superman.
Sure.
I had no interest in it. I was okay with Hawkman. I was okay with
I think bringing those characters in underlined the horror.
Yeah.
Right? That you had this darkness in the world of these amazing superpowered glowing gods, and yet so that made it more scary and more powerful. That would be my counter argument there.
I agree. But you also have to understand some of the conversations that would go on between John Totleben and Stephen Bissette.
Right.
Want me to share just two?
Sure, please.
Okay. You know the DC character Firestorm?
Absolutely.
Okay. Where's his brain? Right? Firestorm has like this head that stops here, and then it's like a Bic lighter, and it's like, where's his brain? Okay. Yeah. The silliness of superheroes is something that when you have to draw them becomes very real. When I was drawing the annual, I remember John and I laughing our asses off. DC had all these supernatural characters who had no eyeballs.
Right.
Right? That's what made them creepy. But when you put them all in one book, Deadman, Phantom Stranger, the Demon, it's like, is this Little Orphan Annie? Am I doing Harold Gray here? There's no eyeballs, right? Not only that, it gets sillier. The Demon. Now, I'm the guy that wanted Etrigan and Swamp Thing, right? John was into it too, but the Demon is one of my all-time favorite horror comics. But what color is the Demon? He is the color of a yield sign and a stop sign. Right. Yellow and red are the least scary colors on the planet, unless you run the stop sign.
Yeah.
Another thing, as we're drawing all these DC characters, Deadman, the Demon, etc., they have little pointed cloth booties.
Yeah.
When you're drawing little pointed cloth booties, you become very hyper aware of how silly little pointed cloth booties really look, right?
Yeah. So one of the things that you did with Deadman, though it's not in this book, but you made him look dead, man.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I made him look like Boris Karloff as Imhotep in The Mummy.
Yeah.
You know? And John Totleben was right on board with that, all the texturing, you know. Yeah. Len Wein was mad at me for this. I drew Phantom Stranger patterned on Lee Van Cleef. I wanted him to look like Colonel Mortimer in For a Few Dollars More, like that hawk face. And Len got the first few pencil pages and he was like, no. And I was like, yeah, you know, it's going to be Lee Van Cleef. That's what I'm going to do. And Len hated that. But Karen was the editor and Karen was like, okay, this looks good, Steve. Go with it. Right. I had to make these, you know, if I had to draw these characters, I had to be convinced that I could make them look real, quote unquote. And with monsters, even the stupidest monsters, I drew for SpongeBob comics, right? I did 3 sets of stories for SpongeBob comics, and Chris Duffy hired me to draw the monsters. I love drawing monsters. They can be goofy, they can be scary, but when I'm drawing superheroes, I have a real hard time maintaining, you know, credibility.
Yeah. Well, you do. I think you did a good job.
Well, thank you. Certain ones were fun to draw, like Hawkman. That's a fun character to draw, right? Yeah. That's a fun character to draw.
Well, I especially loved the way, you know, most people don't usually draw it so that his face is distinct from his mask. You know what I mean? Like
Joe used to, you know, and that's what I was ripping from. Here was my take on superheroes, right? And this is how I justified my approach to them in Swamp Thing, is if we walked into a room that had superheroes in it, real superheroes, we would be scared shitless. So I made them scary as best I could. Firestorm was fucking impossible, though. I'm sorry. A walking Bic lighter is just, I'm sorry. That's silly. Anyway.
Love it.
Continue.
Right, put up the next art, will you, Jordan? Thank you.
This is I just wanted to do another sort of cause and effect. Like, this is the kind of layouts I would sometimes do in covers. And bear in mind, I'm showing you one cover design here. When I was doing covers on Swamp Thing, and I continued doing the covers for part of Rick Veitch's run, I would turn in like 3, 4, 5, sometimes a half dozen different cover ideas. And Karen Berger and the cover editor at that time at DC was Ed Hannigan. They would choose the one they wanted to go with. And here's a case in point where I designed that cover, and either Karen or Ed said, okay, this is a good drawing, this is a good design, but you got to set Swamp Thing on fire. We need a little more action here. So, okay, we set Swamp Thing on fire.
Nice.
Okay.
Upcoming works or? below, right? Yeah, that one.
Okay. You want me to jump to this, Brian, or should we cap up Swamp Thing and then we'll wrap up with that?
Let's. Yeah, I mean, are we there? We covered
It's
it.
up to you. It's up to you. How often do you go over 2 hours with this?
From your thing. So yeah, we did. Okay, very good. So another question I had is in terms of pagination in these comics, because they originally had ads, obviously.
Yep.
And it's interesting because between these two versions, right, the pagination is completely different in terms of left-right pages. The one I'm thinking of most particularly is page 18. I love this page so much. The look in the horror in Swamp Thing's eyes there, and it works so well in this edition because it's the page you see before you turn.
It's the page turn, right?
It's not the opposite, and so it doesn't work nearly as well. So how much of this were you thinking about when you were laying out the original comics, I suppose?
I was thinking about it right from the start. In fact, I drove Len crazy and then Karen crazy because every issue, when I would get the script, I would say, okay, where do the ad pages fall?
Yeah.
Because I wanted, I grew up with Jack Kirby's comics. I grew up with Joe Kubert's comics. The double page spread was the biggest canvas you had as a cartoonist. And I wanted to know where those spreads were.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know where the page turn was. The problem is when you reprint these books in collected editions, there's no ads. And without the ads, it shifts the page turn orientation. And you'll notice in the reprint editions, depending who the editor is, they find different solutions. They'll stick a pinup in the middle of a story to make sure that the page turns accommodate a double page spread later in that chapter, what would have been an issue. I wanted to know because I wanted to make sure that I knew what was the left-facing page and what was the right-facing page, because that was one of my storytelling tools. And I was only thinking as far as what I was paid to think, which was that issue seeing print that month. That was all we were looking at, was the periodical as the unit. We never thought this work would be reprinted.
Books didn't exist then, practically. There were
the only ones that existed is they would do those little digests, year's best comics, and we actually had Swamp Thing number 16, Marty Pasco's first issue with John and I, was reprinted in one of those year's best DC digests. But
the other place that they would do is, I mean, not obviously with a book like Swamp Thing, but they would do those reprint books, which they chopped up the panels so that they could. It was like 2 panels per page max.
We worked on those. Those were some of our Kubert School jobs. In fact, I think that was my first Kubert School job, was cutting up photostats of Superboy and old Batman stories for those little paperbacks, those New American Library paperbacks. Yeah. So we were, we were very cognizant of the page was the unit.
Yeah.
And all that mattered to us when we were doing a periodical was that form. That issue, the way it was going to be printed, that was the storytelling unit. So I would, as soon as I got a script, I was on the phone to Len, I was on the phone to Karen when she was editing, saying, okay, where do the ad pages fall? And then I would thumbnail the issue because I needed to know.
Very much.
And when you look at an issue like, issue 29, the one we were just showing your book club members pages from, I wanted that double page spread of just say uncle. Like that was the climax of this horror story. And it had to be a corker. We were pulling all the stops out and we succeeded. We lost the code. That's pretty good. When we were doing the psychedelic issue, The Rites of Spring, when Swamp Thing and Abby bond, Abby eats one of the hallucinogenic potatoes that grow off of Swamp Thing's back. They go on a psychedelic trip into the green. I wanted to design the entire comic so that you turned it to read it. So I had to know where the ads were. And I couldn't worry about what was out of my control. Okay? There's going to be a Reese's Pieces ad right in the middle of Abby's trip. But sucks for Abby, But I still had to make sure that page, that issue flowed the way I wanted it to. And I designed those pages with the word balloons and everything, so that you would effortlessly turn that comic without even thinking about it.
Yep.
And then at the end of the trip, you turned it back.
Yeah. No, fantastic stuff. It's, as I say, I mean, this is really one of those comics that just made me recognize as a real reader what the potential of the medium was, and that comics could be adult and scary and real and true in a way. You know, I had never encountered anything like it before, and so
I have to say, when we lost the code, you know, people thought we were going to start spilling guts and stuff, and we were like, no, we can tell adult stories now, right? Our hands were still tied. We didn't have the freedom that the writers in the Vertigo line had, you know.
Right.
You know, when friends like I had met Neil Gaiman when he was very young, before he was writing comics, at a convention in England. And when Neil came on with Sandman, Neil and Grant Morrison and Garth and all the writers that followed and the artists that followed, they had more freedom than we had, even after we lost the code. We were still working under, you know, pretty tight strictures. There were certain language Alan could not use. There were certain curse words that couldn't be used. We couldn't include nudity. We didn't care because we knew once we lost the code, we could tell more adult stories. We could tell the story of Swamp Thing and Abby consummating their romance. We could tell the story of a menstruating werewolf. We could tell the story of American Gothic, you know, and we just took it as a license to tell better and more adult stories, not gorier stories, not more lurid stories.
Yeah. Yeah. So Alan clearly had a plan with this, where the character would go and what would happen, but it seems to me like he almost ran through that story and then he had to keep going, right? You got it. So that's when we got the sort of the monster of the month. You know, there was like a year of monster of the month. Yeah. And then there was in space, you know. And
what that was, I can tell you what that was, is DC, this is the beginning of the period of mainstream American comics where editors began to have summer workshops, and suddenly there was continuity plans that would be stretched over an entire year. This is when the initiation of the event book, crossover book, would happen. Okay. Right. And you know better than I don't know if that started with Secret Wars at Marvel. I know that we had to trip over it with the Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Really was Crisis that was the beginning of that. So
when we had to do that Crisis, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The first Secret Wars did not have any crossover issues whatsoever. It was Secret Wars 2 that crossed over into the entire Marvel line. But Crisis would be for sure the one. And, you know, to the point that the readers and the retailers would end up calling some of those issues Red Sky crossovers, because literally nothing would happen in them except some character would point, look, the sky's turned red, and that would be the end of the Crisis crossover. Whereas you guys really built an actual Crisis crossover, probably the biggest one.
Well, and that was Alan. You know, that was Alan saying, okay, this can't be just a random issue. This has to be meaningful. And Alan was, you know, doing his best to make that work. But that was also the issue when I gave my notice. Like once we had to, it had gone beyond just, oh, I don't enjoy drawing superheroes. Once I saw that the overriding continuity of the DC universe was now going to guide where we could or couldn't go with Swamp Thing. Right. Party over. I remember John Toddleben saying on the phone, you know, we put this car on the road and now they're telling us to get in the back seat. Yeah. And it was true. You know, we had felt a real intoxicating energy and chemistry while we were working on Swamp Thing that initial year and a half. And as soon as that, you know, continuity umbrella was placed over us, Alan had to become more strategic about planning a full year ahead. That's when he went, okay, just like Len and Bernie, in their 10 issues of the original Swamp Thing, had done all the key monster stories, Alan decided, okay, we'll do all the key monster stories. We'll do our werewolf. We'll do our, you know, zombie story. We'll do our this, our that. Once it became schematic, the spontaneity of it and the pleasure, the fun of it began to just drain out of it. There were other issues as well that I won't go into in this venue and in this time frame, but you know, that was a big factor for me of going, okay, I'm falling out of love with this, right? This isn't fun anymore. It also became a time where the workload Alan was carrying was becoming overwhelming, right? He was also burning out not just on Swamp Thing, but he was writing Watchmen at this time.
Sure.
Okay. Alan was writing one of the great American graphic novels while staying as best he could on schedule with Swamp Thing and V for Vendetta, finishing V for Vendetta and so on. And
they came out on schedule pretty much. That's the amazing part of it all. You know,
that's
people
because of Karen Berger, you know?
People today often will say, oh yeah, Watchmen, that's one of those, you know, late comics. It was always late. Like, no, it wasn't. They put out 12 issues of Watchmen in 13 months.
Exactly.
Dude, there was one skip month. Yeah. And everybody freaked the fuck out that there was a skip month. But not like it is today where, you know, it takes 3 years for them to put out that doomsday clock or whatever, you know?
And we were planning ahead. Like, we were friends with Stan Walk, you know? John Tolliban was the one who said, get Alfredo Alcala. And it wasn't because Alfredo draws like John. It's because John went, I'm working from the Franklin Booth School of line illustration, and the only other cartoonist doing that works at DC is Alfredo Alcala. And it was a pretty good match. And, you know, Sean McManus coming in, we would schedule and plan those issues ahead. Alan told us he was going to do the Pogo issue. Yeah. And I said, well, you know, I think I can cop Pogo, but that would be a good fill-in issue. I know there's other artists that can cop that Walt Kelly look much better than I can. And sure enough, Sean McManus did a terrific job on the Pog issue. It was better than if John and I had done it, you know?
Yep.
And so we were planning all that way ahead. And Karen Berger was the one orchestrating that whole thing. And she's also trying to factor into that, you know, Steve's always behind and Rick is the one that's really dependable. And how do I coordinate all this? And plus, hey, Brian, I had my second kid in 1985, right? Home birth, right? We had our son Danny at home, just like we did our daughter Maya. You can imagine how that threw the schedule off. And, you know, Karen was still that book came out every month. And she punished me once. One of my favorite issues that I was looking forward to drawing, I got bumped. I had turned in the first 2 or 3 pages, and Karen went, you're too far behind. You're going to start penciling the next issue. Alan's already scripted it, and I'm putting Stan Walk on this. It was The Water Vampire, part 1. And that broke my heart because Alan, John, and I had plotted that issue, you know, in Vermont when Alan was visiting us in Vermont. And it was like, oh, shit, you know. But I made my bed. I had to lay in it, as I say.
I'm amazed that comics got put together at all, in a way.
You're right.
Pre-digital and pre-email and think
about it. Oh yeah.
Granted, you know,
I would get panic calls from Len Wein or Karen Berger, and they would be like, "Call a taxi, get those pages picked up." And I'm like, "I'm in the woods. There's no taxi cabs in Wilmington, Vermont." And they thought I was lying, right? Or that I was like trying to pull something. And as I told you earlier, I mean, for me to get a FedEx package out, that was a lost day. I mean, I'm in the car, I'm driving either to Brattleboro, Vermont or Bennington, Vermont, half hour away from my home, or Greenfield, Massachusetts. I got to go to a photocopy. It was a whole laborious process. And, you know, Karen and Len didn't care about that. All they knew is they were in New York, FedEx, you know, let's go. So
I do one issue. Why don't you see FedEx every day? Well,
I do one issue.
You can't just call FedEx. You know?
I drew one issue of Swamp Thing, the second issue of the Demon Story. I drew in motel rooms in Houma, Louisiana, on a family trip to Louisiana, a research trip that I did myself with my family. And my wife, my first wife, Marlene, and our daughter, Maya, would be sleeping in the motel room, and I would be in the bathroom with the lights on, penciling pages to get them out in FedEx the next morning to Karen.
Wow.
That's the conditions we were doing this book under, right?
Yeah. And it's amazing because it doesn't look like it. That's the thing. It doesn't show at all.
One of the benefits of being an insane cartoonist is you put the insanity on the page. So, you know, I would pour that angst and anxiety and exhaustion into making the demon look as cool as fucking possible.
And it works, man. This is insane because we've been talking for 2.5 hours, and I feel like I'm blinking twice. But
you name the day, and I'll do it. Should probably wrap this up. So.
No, I mean, I actually, you know, I think we will pick this up with the self-published part of your career on.
Okay.
While I have you now, I actually do want to sort of jump forward to like the last decade and a half.
Okay.
with you teaching at CCS. And only the reason I want to cover that in this interview is because you were talking about the Kubert School.
Yeah.
And so you were at the first school for comics, and then you ended up teaching at a school for comics. And so I'd sort of like you to kind of maybe sort of tie a bow on that somehow.
Oh, yeah. Let me do that, please. Thank you, Brian. Gotta say, this is the historian who taught comics history for 15 years coming out. The Kubert School was actually the second American comics college, right? And what became the School of Visual Arts started as an illustration school that Bern Hogarth co-founded. And that's really the first cartooning school that I know of in North American history. So, but in my lifetime, you're right. Joe Kubert, first cartooning school. I'm a graduating member of the first class, and I graduate from the Kubert School, and I'm like, how will I ever pay Joe and Muriel back? There is no way. There is no way I can repay to Joe Kubert, to Muriel Kubert, to the entire Kubert family, to our instructors, you know, the late, great Rick Estrada, the late, great Lee Elias, the late, great Dick Giordano, Kelly Harris, thankfully still teaching at the Kubert School, Hi Eisman. What a miracle. How can I pay them back? There is no way I can pay them back. And then in 2005, I'm at an academic conference at Bennington College, and a friend that I have made over the years that we have corresponded, James Sturm, is also at that conference. And James Sturm is there with a mission. He pulls me aside and he shows me the original art that had been prepared by Seth, the Canadian cartoonist Seth, for the first brochure for a new cartooning school, the Center for Cartoon Studies. Mm-hmm. And at that conference, I presented a 1-hour condensed form of a slide lecture that I had been presenting on the convention circuit since 1988 that I called Journeys into Fear. It was a slide lecture history of the horror comic. And I was doing a 1-hour version. The longest version went 5 days at Smith College. And after that lecture, James Stern corralled me and said, I need you at the school. You're going to be a teacher at my school. I'm going to open this school. And he showed me Seth's art, and he told me what he was planning. And I'm listening to him and I'm going, this sounds crazy, right? And I was like, where are you going to do this? And he said, I think we're going to do it at White River Junction, Vermont. And I went, White River Junction? Like White River Junction, my entire life, Brian, has been the armpit of my home state. Okay. White River Junction was this town that thrived in the 18th and 19th century. It was the center of commerce, communication. Two rivers, mighty rivers, come together, the White River, the Connecticut River. They would cut trees and run the logs down the river, pull them up on trains, and all the trains ran out of White River Junction. That's why Junction's in its name. And all that had imploded in the mid-20th century. And it was a town on the skids. It was the town that I only knew from whenever I took a bus north or south out of northern Vermont. I got stuck in White River Junction for 3 or 4 hours between buses, and there was nothing. There was nowhere to eat. There was nowhere to go. And James said he was going to open a school there. And I went, James, White River? And he went, it's because there's nothing there. I think creative economy could reinvigorate this town. And there's affordable classroom space there. And he was right. So I started teaching in 2005, and I taught there for over 15 years. I was in the first faculty at the Center for Cartoon Studies, started with our first summer workshop in the summer of 2005, and I didn't retire until June of this year, 2020.
Yeah.
And it was incredible. And the reason I want to link it around is the minute I said yes to it, I realized this is how I can pay back what Joe and Muriel did. I can't pay back Joe and Muriel as individuals. I will never be able to, and they're gone now. God bless them. That's a debt I can never repay on a personal level. But on the professional level, I could be on the other side of the classroom. Yeah. And I had the unique experience with my students. And I always told every class, every year, I was sitting right where you were, and I was telling the truth, because I was. I knew exactly what the cartooning school experience was from the student side of it. I knew how hard the work was. I knew the kind of dedication it required. And I knew the obsession that fueled their wanting to be there. And it was the best thing I could have done with my life. I mean, you know, having kids was the greatest adventure of my life.
Sure.
You know, my daughter Maya, my son Daniel, my stepson Mike, our grandkids. That's the greatest adventure of my life. But teaching was right up there. Second greatest adventure of my life. And it was incredible. It was just incredible. Felt like I could give something back to the entire comics continuum, I guess.
Let's talk about how obviously the industry has changed
Oh God, yeah, night and day.
I mean, you know, not just in terms of the mechanical things that we were talking about, right? Like in terms of you know, artists now can email those pages.
Yeah, the technology, that's one thing. Right.
But it's also changed in terms of the ecosystem. It seems to me that, you know, the gigs penciling a 20-page comic book, you know, are not the kind of gigs that most of the students are pursuing anymore. They're doing graphic novels and things like that. So how has that changed the way that you think about comics and the way that you teach comics?
It's changed it radically. And it's been a process. When I first started teaching in 2005, it was still a key part of comics history to illuminate the students on how periodical literature functioned.
Yeah.
Right? How periodical comics were the staple diet and why graphic novels emerged from periodicals. But by 2015, that was no longer true. And by 2020, it's an afterthought. The mainstream is no longer DC and Marvel.
Correct.
The mainstream is Scholastic. The mainstream is Abrams' imprint of graphic novels.
Right.
The mainstream is an entirely different beast than anything we could have imagined in 1976 when I started at the Kubert School. In fact, the benchmark for me experientially is during my first year at the Kubert School, one of the guests that Joe Kubert brought in was Will Eisner. And Will Eisner was very cagey, talking about this new project he was working on, and that was A Contract with God.
Right.
So the graphic novel under that name, under that marketing moniker that caught on, was happening as I entered the field. And by the time James Sturm and Michelle Awley, the co-founders of the Center for Cartoon Studies, invited me into teaching the school, it was already apparent to me that we were in a whole different mode, that graphic novels is a different mode of communication.
Sure.
They're created differently. They require different thresholds of dedication, of love, of labor. They were a different marketplace. It was an entirely different beast. And I was a dinosaur. Okay. I love dinosaurs. I always have, luckily. Good thing, because now I am one.
Yeah.
And it was hard to communicate to my students that the way we put comics together, you know, the generations before me and my generation that I'm part of, was so different from how graphic novels are put together.
Sure.
And people forget, I mean, I've gotten in arguments at academic conferences with people who've gotten very upset with me, actually, when I point out that, well, technically Watchmen's not a graphic novel, right? Because graphic novels are fully shaped and formed, right? You can conceive of them, you can work through them, and when you get to the end of what you think is your first draft, you can then go back and rework. Well, Alan didn't have that. Dave Gibbons, Alan Moore didn't have that. It was being serialized as they did it. So they were still doing a variation of how Charles Dickens novels were written and published, right? Yeah. They were serialized and published chapter by chapter. And when it was done, Dickens didn't go back and rewrite the whole thing. He moved on to the next book, the next serialization. The only member of the Watchmen team who ever got to go back and rework it was the colorist.
Yeah.
Okay. So I look at that and go, okay, there's a lot of flaws in Watchmen. And most of the flaws I see there, the things that stick in my craw, are because it was a serialized work that was collected and put out as a novel. Now, Alan and Dave Gibbons did conceive it as a novelized work, a novel, but they never got to go back and do the polish. And I see firsthand with my students the care. I've never done a graphic novel. You know, Rick Veitch and I did 1941. That's still the only graphic novel I've ever done, where we actually worked on it beginning to end, turned it in. It wasn't serialized. It was complete. Yeah. But we certainly didn't have the time to go back and finesse anything. Trust me. So it's a very different creature now. And my involvement with the evolution of that form was not as writer or an artist. It was because I was editing and publishing and co-publishing Taboo.
Right.
And through Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell with From Hell, Alan Moore and Melinda Gebbie with the beginning of Lost Girls, all that was serialized originally in Taboo, which was a horror anthology I edited and published and co-published.
Yep.
And particularly, the one I really learned a lot from was Jeff Nicholson, who completed the graphic novel Through the Habit Trails in Taboo. It was the only graphic novel that actually fully was published in serialized form during Taboo's run of 10 volumes.
Yeah.
And that's where I learned, okay, how this process worked. And I had a lot of peers and friends at that time. You know, I became friends with Dave McKean and Neil Gaiman, and watching Dave and Neil craft the work they did together and the work that they did, you know, separately with other collaborators or on their own. In the case of Cages with Dave McKean, I got to see firsthand and secondhand and thirdhand what was involved with crafting those graphic novels. And I was close friends with people like Howard Cruz. And early on, I was one of the people Howard reached out to when he was working on Stuck Rubber Baby, when he was trying to brainstorm, like, how am I gonna subsidize doing this work? He got a very generous advance, but it was all gone after a year and a half or 2 years, right? And he still had another 3 years of work ahead of him.
Sure.
And, you know, and Howard was one of those people who, okay, he pre-sold the original art, and that carried along for a year.
Right.
And then he applied to the Guggenheim, right? After Art Spiegelman got a Guggenheim grant, Howard thought, well, maybe I can get one. And I was one of the circle that he tapped to write a letter of recommendation. And I bring this up because, you know, it was a real struggle for a graphic novelist like Howard Cruz to finish that graphic novel, because there is still no economic model that adequately compensates any creator for the time span that's involved in the kind of graphic novels that set the benchmark for graphic novels.
This is kind of what I wanted to get to you with, because it seems to me that we're graduating, and we don't just have CCS, right? There's multiple.
No, there's others now. There's SAW down in Florida, and other colleges have been offering variation programs.
CSA here in San Francisco, and so we're.
However, I will say CCS and SAW are still unique in that they are academic programs entirely built around creating graphic novels. It's not like a secondary to other degrees, but anyway, right.
But it seems to me that we're graduating 45 to 60 new creators every single year, feeding them into this wood chipper where they're expected as their first work to do a 200-page story, and we give them $20,000 for it. Which means
$20,000. No one's given me $20,000 in my life to do anything.
Sure, right. But let's say it was $20,000 for a 200-page book. That's $100 a page. That's what you were making from heavy metal back in 1977.
Not only that, Brian. When I did my $200 a page work for heavy metal, I sat at my drawing board. I did what my son would call analog work rather than digital work, right? Yeah. And then I delivered a page to an art director. I did not have to scan it. I did not have to design a book. We now have a generation of graphic novelists who have taken on the workloads of entire paid departments of publishing houses, the way that things used to function. And they do all of that work, including lettering, coloring, et cetera, right?
Yep. And when you actually start looking, books sell, or at least what we can publicly see through the book scan sales, which obviously not the whole thing, but I analyze these numbers, and it's really clear to me that most original graphic novels probably never make their advance back. So
most of them aren't paying $20,000. Okay, a lot of people are doing graphic novels for $2,000, for $5,000, for $6,000.
So they're making.
And let's also parse out for
an hour to do this book, and they're not making the money back on the back end. Is my point.
I agree. And
this seems like a really dangerous thing to me. It seems to me that this is more likely to not produce people like you who have a 40-year career in comics, you know?
Well, wait a minute. Let's scale this back. Let's actually look at how some of these creators have actually done the work, okay? Sure. They have economic models that were undreamed of prior to the internet era, okay? So I'll just give you for instances of graduates from CCS, alumni of CCS. Melissa Mendes is doing this wonderful graphic novel that's being funded largely by Patreon. In fact, I'm one of the subscribers. I kick in $20 a month, and what I get from Melissa is the latest serialized mini comic version of the chapter Work in Progress. And I also get it, via email. Melissa sends out the pages to her subscribers, to her patrons. Her partner, Chuck Forsman, had a different economic model. Yeah. Chuck decided to create Oily Comics, OILY, and Chuck figured, well, I'll get my work done in mini comic form, and I'll subsidize it by offering to print and distribute work by other cartoonists who I consider like-minded. Okay, that he felt some empathy and sympathy for their work. It fit his aesthetic, his circle. So Chuck was able to finish a mini comic in serialized form called The End of the Fucking World. Okay, now the only income that Chuck had at that time was from the subscriptions. He created 6-month subscription model, and he made it 6 months so that he only had to do one concentrated piece of bookkeeping where people would pay in advance for a 6-month subscription. Then he could forget about the checkbook and the bookkeeping for a time, get the work out. Every month I got an envelope that had his comic and comics by Alex Kim and other cartoonists. And that was the deal. And then after 6 months, you could re-up, or new people could jump on. But that's how Chuck sort of parsed out, okay, here's when I do business, then I have time to work. Sure. Then he went with the Patreon model. And then Chuck had that lightning strike that, a lot of creators dream of, more often their families dream of, that somebody picked up the mini comic and went, this would be a good TV miniseries. Now, there's an example of just two people who have found models to complete serialized work over a span of time, and they have figured out different economic models because no publisher was going to hand them 20 grand. Yeah. And I also have to make clear for the Graphic Book Club members, let's stick with that 20 grand figure for just a moment. That graphic novel, let's say you have 2 years on your contract and you contract for $20,000. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, that does not mean that you get a lump sum of $20,000 that you then carefully dole out to yourself to make it last for 2 years. Yeah. You get a quarter up front. Yeah. You get a quarter when you're done. Yep. You get a quarter when it sees print. Yeah. You get a quarter 6 months after it sees print. So even when you've contractually got a $20,000 advance, more often than not, you're doing other work to subsidize your graphic novel work. I can't tell you how many graphic novelists out there are working day jobs, part-time jobs. More often, as my generation did. Go ahead.
A lot of these people, and they're all amazingly talented artists who turn out amazing work. It's amazing work, but I see very few people who are actually making a sustainable living. Now, obviously, if you hit the lottery, if you are Raina or Dave Pilkey, or if you're in Forsman's case, you're able to sell, a television show. That's fantastic. But
yeah. But let's back up. Let's back up.
A better place that we could actually pay people for doing the cartooning, right?
Let's back up. Raina did years of mini.
Obviously, yeah, stipulated. I'm not trying to dismiss that. I guess what I'm trying to say is it frustrates me, much like musicians no longer make money off music, right? True. Like you have to make money from merchandise now, and I just wonder what you think about this. If this is actually a sustainable model.
Well, let's be clear. other than newspaper comics, right? Daily comic strips and Sunday comics. The entire history of the American comic book industry was built on the backs of the freelancers. Right? Sure. They were almost all, with the exception of those that worked in a studio environment, the Iger Eisner studio, what have you. They're working in their own homes, under their own head of steam, paying their own rent or mortgage or whatever, and making that work happen. And all these companies have built these empires, and they are empires now, right? Marvel under the Disney umbrella, DC under now the AT&T umbrella. These empires were built on the backs of tens of thousands of freelancers who were subsidizing their own work. That whole time that we were working on Swamp Thing, Brian, the reason I was so thankful, and still I'm thankful to retailers, is at the page rates we were getting, the only way that John Taliban and I could subsidize the work moving forward at that page rate was to do those conventions and those comic shops appearances, because selling sketches, and then once there was a readership that wanted our original art, selling our original art is what paid the bills. And it drove our editors nuts. Karen Berger tried to forbid me from going to conventions. And I once explained to her, Karen, you guys play all these games with the paychecks. You think that by holding back the paychecks, I'm going to crank out the pages faster. My rent is due at the first of every month. And the conventions are the only thing allowing me to pay my rent. And even then, Brian, my first wife, Marlene, and I were earning under the poverty level. We were getting state subsidized dairy for our children delivered to our home, eggs and milk and so on, because with Marlene working full-time at a school for autistic children and me working as hard as I had ever worked before in my life in comics on a monthly book, which should have been a gravy train, we were under the poverty level with our annual income. It's the entire history of comics is built on freelancers making ends meet any way they can. And this graphic novel market we're in is no different. And some of the great graphic novels that are being created right now are coming out on Kickstarter, right? And you look at Kickstarter, Indiegogo, all the crowdfunding, some of those people end up with crazy $250,000, right? But that's the exception, not the rule. Most of them just meet their goal, and then they finish their book and they print it and they go, holy shit, postal rates have gone up since I did my, and they're not, they haven't even broken even. They're in the red after they ship out their goal, right?
No, and they never really planned out anything other than fulfilling the Kickstarter itself. So it's not like they print an extra 5,000 copies so that they have copies to sell.
Well, that's one way to put it. But where do you store your 5,000 copies? Who's going to ship it? Will Diamond even take the book? It's like, we are once the direct sale market imploded in the mid-90s. I mean, when I started Tyrant, that was the first workable model in my entire life where solicit the issue. I knew how many I sold before I printed, and you knew how many you'd ordered, and we were able to subsidize one another. And, for someone like Rick Veitch or Tim Truman, who actually make their deadlines, it was amazing. And once that imploded, once it came down to Diamond being the monopoly, it was no longer as functional a model as it had been up to 1996.
Yeah. I'm going to put a pin in it right there.
Yeah, right there.
That's part 2 of this interview, which we'll do in a couple of months.
Yeah, I'm here for you whenever you say, Brian. Let's make sure we both get there, okay?
I want to just really super quickly, we should end this in 15 minutes. Any of these questions, things that you think that we should...
Yeah, let's answer some questions. There must be a couple good ones.
Gonna kind of lightning round this a little bit.
Okay, let's do it. One sentence answers.
All right, this is Jordan's favorite. In your opinion, Pudrigu, who always asks fantastic questions. In your opinion, what role or roles do monsters play in our lives?
Monsters are incredibly important. Monsters are the closest we get to an actual manifestation of all those repressed and otherwise inexpressible emotions in our lives. And monsters become a way of manifesting them into an imaginary material form. I think monsters are beautiful. I think monsters are amazing and vital. I also think monsters are important because they often manifest the very things we're afraid to talk about in our lives. And in any culture, whatever is taboo because it's the most important thing in that culture. If it wasn't, then talking about it would be no problem. And monsters become a way of communicating about those vital things that in our day-to-day lives, there really are no permissible modes for expressing or talking about. And I also think monsters are a way that we commune with nature. And here in the 21st century, we are so cut off from nature. Monsters kind of become that kind of primal conduit, and I think they're really vital. Obviously, I'm dedicated to them as a mode of expression.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. You got another one for me, Jordan? Where is it? How many comic books do you have?
Oh God, I have tens of thousands of comic books. In fact, one of the struggles I've got, I'm 60, I just turned 65 in March. So one of the struggles I got is, what am I going to do with all this shit? I am not going to waste, whatever time I have on this planet selling them issue by issue on eBay. I've worked out with a couple of museums and collections. Some of the work will go there. Some of the work some of the comics I'm just going to give away. Please don't write me and ask, because you won't get what you want. And some of the work, a lot of the comics I have are also artifacts of my own career. And I've been careful over the years to try to always get, 3-4 copies of everything I've done, so that there's a set for my daughter, Maya, there's a set for my son, Daniel, there's a set for my son, Mike. And now that we have grandkids, I'll probably be, parsing out and labeling them for them. So, but I have a shitload of comics. I got comics going back to, the 1800s.
Nice.
And a lot of it I also accumulated as teaching tools.
Sure.
And since I've retired from teaching, some of that stuff I began donating. In fact, I sent a donation to Columbia University, Karen Green at Columbia University, right before COVID-19 hit. And I'm hoping once the universities and the museums get back on their feet, I can reestablish those ties and direct some of that work into the hands of collections where they'll be available for future creators, future researchers, future scholars, etc. If we don't preserve that heritage, it's going to be gone. So
yeah, I agree. Jordan, is that it? So Jordan says that's it. So let's flip over. You had some stuff you wanted to plug.
Yeah, this is new work that came out this year. I know people wish I was back to comics. I do a lot of writing. I've been freelance writing since the late 80s. The book on the left, Studio of Screams, I am the co-author of this book. It just came out this month, October, from PS Publications. They're based in the United Kingdom, but they do ship to all countries. It's a terrific book, if I may say so. Stephen Volk, Mark Morris, Tim Levin, and Christopher Golden all wrote novellas, 4 novellas. The premise is that there were horror movies made in England in the 60s and 70s that people have forgotten. And these novellas are the movie novelizations. And my job was to write the framing text material that tells the story of this forgotten movie studio in England and how these movies were made and the secret behind Blythewood Studios. The book on the right, Brooding Creatures, will be out in time for Christmas. It's my first sketchbook that I've put together. It has been curated and designed by Mark Mastel, a terrific cartoonist and graphic novelist in his own right. And by the way, the color on this cover illustration is by my friend John Jennings. It's the first jam that John and I did, and it won't be the last. And Brooding Creatures will be out in time for Christmas, and that will be coming out via Ingram Spark as a print on demand. And hopefully, Brian, we will figure out a way so that that's a book that could be carried in your store.
Sounds fantastic.
Next up, there we go. I also have these 2 books out right now, folks. The book on the left is the cover art for a brand new edition of a book I did about a decade or so ago called The Vermont Monster Guide. It's written and created by folklorist and novelist Joseph A. Citro, one of my best friends in the world. In fact, this cover design is Joe's design. He came up with the idea of the Lake Champlain Monster Champ as a question mark. And the Vermont Monster Guide just came out in a brand new edition from Erie Lights, a publisher out of Texas. And the book on the right came out back in April from PS Publications in the UK. It's also available now in America via Amazon and various online sites. It is a 660-page book that analyzes the creation, the making of, the production, the release, and the aftermath of David Cronenberg's 1979 horror movie, The Brood, one of my all-time favorite horror movies. So that's 4 brand new works out this year that most people in comic shops have no idea even exist. And I'm hoping now they do. No.
Very much so. Very much so. That's excellent. Stephen, I want to thank you for talking with us today. Great conversation. And as I say, if and when Tyrant comes back into print, we'll make that a selection of the club as well. and we'll come back and we'll do part 2, and we'll do all of the self-publishing years and all of that. I think that also would be a fantastic fucking conversation.
I'm totally up for it, Brian.
Has just been great, though. This has been everything that I was hoping it would be, and the comments on the side seem like people like it too.
Great.
If you are watching this at home and you have not yet read Saga the Swamp Thing, I think that you should get this book right away. It is one of the cornerstone fundamental graphic novels in comics. It's a fantastic horror comic. It's smart. It's literate. It's so beautiful. So beautiful. Thanks to Stephen Bissette here. If you buy it from us, from our web store, it'll also come with a signed book plate that is exclusive to us.
I signed it with my own little hand.
Yay! And so that's that. Next month, we return with Kingdom Come will be next month's selection. And I'm talking to Mark Wade about Kingdom Come and everything that goes into a book like this. That should be a fascinating conversation as well. Our regular adult graphic novel of the month club. The book this month is Displacement by Kiku Hughes. That conversation is in about 2 weeks. So subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. We do these all the time. And feel free to join the club there. There's the link at the bottom, graphicnovelclub.com. This is the classic club. We also have an adult club and we have a kids club. And I hope that we get more members because that's what is keeping the comic shops alive right now. So that's it for me. Thank you so much, Stephen. Really appreciate your time and your candor and your reminiscence and your history lessons. And this was great. I could not have asked for a better show. Thank
Brian,
you so much.
Thanks so much for inviting me in. And please, everyone out there, do everything you can to support your comics retailers. Join the Graphic Novel Book Club. Support the local comics retailer who may still be in your area. And one of the things that's going to help us get through this crazy time we're all in is read comics.
I agree. And with that, thank you, everyone. We'll see you next month.